The spring sun hung high over Lake Tahoe, its golden light stretching across the crystal clear water like a giant mirror laid flat against the earth. Nathan Mercer sat in his old wooden boat, the fishing line dropping into water so deep he could see the gravel at the bottom more than 4 meters below. The boat creaked beneath him with each gentle sway, a familiar sound that had become the rhythm of his solitary existence. His father had built this vessel 40 years ago in a workshop behind their Montana farmhouse, and Nathan had inherited it along with nothing else when the old man passed. Some men leave their sons money or land or advice worth remembering. His father left him a boat and a single sentence spoken on his deathbed that Nathan still turned over in his mind like a stone worn smooth by years of handling. On the dock, Ethan lay on his stomach, flipping through a book about airplanes. The 9-year-old had positioned himself in a patch of sunlight that warmed the weathered wooden planks beneath him, and his bare feet kicked absently in the air as he studied each page with the intensity of a scholar examining ancient texts. His brown eyes moved across diagrams of jet engines and cross-sections of fuselages, occasionally widening when he encountered something particularly fascinating. The boy had his mother's eyes. Nathan noticed this every single day, and every single day it sent a familiar ache through his chest that he had learned to carry like an old injury that never fully healed. The rows of pine trees stood around the valley like the walls of an ancient cathedral, their branches reaching toward the sky in silent supplication. Birds sang their morning songs, calls echoing through the still air and bouncing off the mountains that ring the lake like protective guardians. A hawk circled lazily overhead, riding thermal currents with effortless grace, its shadow passing briefly across Nathan's boat before disappearing into the vastness of the blue above. In that moment, the world felt both small and safe, contained within this valley that Nathan had chosen as his sanctuary 6 years ago, when everything he knew and loved had been torn away from him. Nathan watched his son from across the water, and something tightened in his chest. Ethan had been 3 years old when they came here, too young to remember the life they had left behind, too young to understand why his mother never came home that terrible October day. The boy knew only this cabin, this lake, this quiet existence carved out of pine forests and mountain silence. He knew his father fixed engines for the people in town, and that they lived simply but comfortably. He knew his mother had died when he was small, though Nathan had never found the words to explain how or why. Some truths were too heavy to place on a child's shoulders. The morning passed in comfortable silence, punctuated only by the occasional splash of a fish breaking the surface, and Ethan's excited announcements whenever he discovered something new in his book. Nathan caught 2 trout, modest specimens that would make a decent dinner, and he cleaned them right there in the boat with practiced efficiency. His hands moved automatically through the familiar motions, while his mind drifted to the list of repairs waiting for him in the workshop. Bill Hendricks had brought in an old John Deere tractor that needed a new fuel pump, and Frank Patterson's chainsaw had finally given up the ghost after 30 years of faithful service. Simple work for simple pay, enough to keep the lights on and food in the pantry, and Ethan in books about airplanes. Nathan had once designed systems that challenged gravity itself. He had written equations that predicted airflow patterns across experimental wing configurations and stress calculations that determined whether a fuselage would hold together at 30,000 feet. He had been brilliant according to his performance reviews. Innovative, a rising star at Sterling Aerospace with a corner office view of San Francisco Bay and a future so bright it seemed to illuminate everything it touched. Now he fixed lawnmowers and chainsaws in a wooden shed behind a cabin that didn't appear on most maps, and he told himself this was enough. He told himself this every morning when he woke and every night before he slept, and most of the time he almost believed it. Ethan looked up from his book and waved, his face splitting into a grin that showed the gap where his front tooth had fallen out last week. Nathan waved back, feeling the familiar warmth spread through his chest that always accompanied moments like these. The boy was everything. The boy was the reason Nathan had signed that document 6 years ago, instead of fighting until they destroyed him completely. The boy was the reason he had driven north until the roads turned to dirt and the cell towers disappeared, and the world that had broken him became nothing but a distant memory. Ethan deserved a father who was present, not one consumed by rage and grief and the futile pursuit of justice against enemies too powerful to defeat. The spring air carried the scent of pine and melting snow from the higher elevations a clean smell that Nathan had come to associate with safety and solitude. He breathed it in deeply, filling his lungs with mountain air that had never known the pollution of cities or the stench of jet fuel or the acrid smoke of burning wreckage. Here in this valley that time seemed to have forgotten, he could almost convince himself that the past was truly past, that the nightmares that still woke him some nights were nothing but echoes of a life that belonged to someone else entirely. Then the sky was suddenly torn apart. A piercing shriek ripped through the air, metal screaming as if being twisted by giant invisible hands. Nathan jerked his head up, his entire body going rigid with a recognition that bypassed conscious thought entirely. He knew that sound. He had heard it in simulations and test recordings, and once, just once in person, when everything he had tried to prevent came true in the most horrible way imaginable. A private jet was plunging downward at a terrifying angle, black smoke spewing from the right engine and spiraling into a long trail that scarred the perfect blue sky like a wound that would not stop bleeding. The aircraft was close, too close, descending in a trajectory that Nathan's trained eye immediately calculated would end in the lake less than 200 meters from where he sat frozen in his boat. His mind raced through possibilities, even as his hands gripped the wooden sides of the vessel hard enough to turn his knuckles white. Engine failure on the starboard side. Catastrophic based on the smoke pattern. The pilot was trying to level out, fighting against physics and failing the plane's nose, pitching up and down in desperate attempts to maintain some semblance of controlled flight. Ethan's panicked scream echoed from the dock, cutting through the mechanical shriek like a knife through paper. The boy had abandoned his book and scrambled to his feet, his small body trembling as he watched the impossible sight of an airplane falling from the sky directly toward them. Nathan shouted toward the dock, his voice rough with fear he could not allow himself to feel. "Stay there, Ethan. Don't get in the water. No matter what happens, you stay right there." The aircraft slammed into the lake with a sound that Nathan would hear in his nightmares for years to come. A deafening explosion of water and metal white spray shooting upward, tens of meters high, catching the sunlight and creating a momentary rainbow that seemed obscenely beautiful against the violence of the impact. Waves rolled outward in concentric circles, reaching Nathan's boat and rocking it so violently that he nearly lost his balance. The smell hit him next, jet fuel spreading across the water's surface in iridescent patterns, sharp and chemical and horrifyingly familiar. Nathan threw himself into the lake before his conscious mind had finished processing what he was doing. The cold water sliced into his skin. The skin like 1,000 tiny blades, shocking his system and stealing his breath for a crucial second before training and adrenaline took over. He swam fast, arms driving hard through water that had become clouded with debris and fuel, his eyes fixed on the rising column of black smoke that marked the crash site. Each stroke brought him closer to the wreckage and further from the safety of his carefully constructed isolation. He was about to become part of someone else's story, and some instinct he could not name told him that nothing would be the same after this. The smell of jet fuel grew thick as he approached, burning his nose and throat with each desperate breath. His eyes watered from the fumes and the physical exertion, but he kept swimming, driven by an imperative that went deeper than thought. The closer he got, the clearer the situation became. The plane was sinking with terrifying speed, its fuselage already half submerged and tilting toward the depths like a dying whale beginning its final descent. Air bubbles rose from somewhere within the wreckage, each one a clock ticking down toward the moment when whoever was inside would have no more time left. Nathan took one deep breath, held it, and dove underwater. The world became hazy and distorted, filtered through lake water that had been stirred into murky confusion by the impact. Fuel leaking from the wreck formed a black mist that spread through the water like blood from a wound. Nathan's eyes stung as if they were being cut by invisible blades, and his lungs began to burn almost immediately, protesting the strain he was placing on them. But he kept swimming, arms pulling him deeper, hands sweeping blindly through the freezing dark as he searched for any sign of the cockpit. Then he saw it. The cockpit was intact, but damaged, its door warped by the impact, and its glass shattered into a spiderweb of cracks. Inside, a figure struggled weakly, in movements becoming more sluggish with each passing second. A woman, Nathan realized as he drew closer. Her arm was trapped in the seatbelt, twisted at an angle that suggested she had been thrown violently against the restraint during impact. Her other hand clawed at the belt mechanism, but her movements were slow and uncoordinated, the universal signs of oxygen deprivation setting in. Nathan swam to her, grabbed the door frame with both hands, and pulled with everything he had. The metal groaned in protest, a deep vibration that traveled through the water and into his bones, but the door did not move. His lungs screamed for air, black spots beginning to dance at the edges of his vision. He pulled again, this time bracing his foot against the fuselage for leverage, putting his entire body into the effort. The door gave way with a shriek of tortured metal, swinging open just enough for him to squeeze through. His lungs were about to burst. His head spun with the desperate need for oxygen. But he pushed inside anyway, his fingers finding the seatbelt mechanism and working it with the precision of hands that had spent years manipulating far more complex systems. The belt released and the woman's body drifted free. Her eyes closed now, her face pale in the filtered light that reached them from the surface. Nathan wrapped his arm around her midsection and kicked upward with every ounce of strength remaining in his oxygen-starved body. The ascent took forever and no time at all. His vision narrowed to a tunnel focused on the bright circle of sunlight above, growing larger with each desperate kick of his legs. His chest felt like it was being crushed by an enormous weight, his body's reflexes screaming at him to open his mouth and breathe, even though there was nothing but water to breathe. He held on to the woman with one arm and clawed toward the surface with the other, fighting against the weight of two bodies and the drag of waterlogged clothing and the fundamental unfairness of physics. When they broke the surface, sunlight exploded into his vision like a physical blow. Nathan gasped for air, huge lungfuls of it, his body shaking with the effort of simply existing after what he had just put it through. He dragged the woman up beside him, supporting her head above water, and began patting her back with his free hand. She was not breathing. Her face had taken on a bluish tint that he recognized from emergency training courses taken a lifetime ago. He struck her back harder, once, twice, a third time, the blows landing between her shoulder blades with enough force to hurt. She coughed, once weakly, then again more forcefully, water ejecting from her lungs in a spray that mixed with the fuel-slicked surface of the lake. Her eyes opened, frantic and unfocused at first, then slowly sharpening as consciousness returned. Her gaze locked with Nathan's, two strangers, connected by the most intimate of circumstances, one having just pulled the other back from the threshold of death. Nathan did not know she was Victoria Sterling. He did not know that her company bore the name that haunted his nightmares, that her family had built an empire on the graves of people whose warnings went unheeded. He did not know that saving her would change both their lives in ways no one could predict, or that this woman carried the key to a painful past he thought he had buried forever. In that moment, there was only the fundamental relief of survival, the primal satisfaction of having reached into death's grasp and pulled someone back to life. He swam toward shore, towing her through water that still burned with leaked fuel, his exhausted muscles screaming with each stroke. In the distance, he could hear Ethan calling for him, the boy's voice high with fear and relief. Emergency sirens began to wail somewhere on the mountain roads. First responders racing toward a disaster they would arrive too late to prevent. Nathan's feet found the bottom at last, and he stood in chest-deep water, lifting the woman higher to keep her face clear of the surface as he waded toward the dock where his son waited with tear-streaked cheeks and trembling hands. The woman's grip on his arm tightened suddenly, her fingers digging into his flesh with surprising strength for someone who had been unconscious moments before. Her words came out raspy and broken, damaged by the water she had inhaled and the trauma of the crash. "Thank you, whoever you are. Thank you." Nathan said nothing in response. He simply kept walking toward shore, toward his son, toward the life he had built from the wreckage of his former existence. The sirens grew louder. The smoke from the crashed plane continued to rise into the perfect blue sky. And somewhere in the back of Nathan's mind, a warning bell began to sound, quiet but insistent, telling him that this moment of heroism would cost him something he was not yet prepared to pay. Frank Patterson arrived before the emergency services did, his ancient pickup truck bouncing down the dirt road that led to Nathan's property with a speed that seemed impossible for a vehicle of its age. The 72-year-old general store owner had heard the crash from 3 miles away and recognized immediately that something catastrophic had occurred near the lake. He burst from his truck with an agility that belied his years, his face a mask of concern that shifted to relief when he saw Nathan standing on the dock, soaking wet but apparently unharmed. The woman sat wrapped in a blanket that Ethan had retrieved from the cabin, her teeth chattering despite the warmth of the spring morning. She had not spoken since her initial words of thanks, her eyes fixed on the column of smoke, still rising from the spot where her plane had disappeared beneath the surface. Nathan stood nearby, keeping a careful distance, his own wet clothes clinging to his body as water dripped from his hair and pulled on the wooden planks beneath his feet. Frank's eyes moved from Nathan to the woman to the smoke and back again, putting together a picture that his years of experience made all too clear. His words carried the gravel of 7 decades and the steady calm of a man who had seen worse things in jungles half a world away. I called 911 from the store. They're sending everything they've got. Coast Guard Fire Department ambulance. Gonna be a circus here within the hour. Nathan nodded but did not speak. His gaze remained fixed on his son, who had attached himself to Nathan's leg and showed no signs of letting go anytime soon. The boy's face was pale, his eyes wide, with the kind of fear that comes from seeing something that shatters your understanding of how the world works. Planes were supposed to stay in the sky. That was the fundamental promise that all those books about aviation made. They were not supposed to fall burning into the lake where you and your father spent quiet mornings fishing for trout. The first helicopter appeared over the mountain ridge 20 minutes later, its rotors chopping the air, with a sound that made the woman flinch violently and pull the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Emergency boats arrived shortly after, roaring across the lake's surface toward the crash site with crews who would find nothing but wreckage and jet fuel and the body of a pilot who had not survived the initial impact. Nathan learned this detail later when the investigators came to take his statement. The pilot had been dead before the plane hit the water, his chest crushed by the control panel when the cockpit crumpled on impact. The woman had survived only because she had been seated in the passenger compartment, protected by the configuration of the aircraft, and by luck that seemed almost impossible in its magnitude. The paramedics took the woman away on a stretcher, despite her protests that she was fine and did not need medical attention. Her tone had gained strength during the wait, revealing an authority that spoke of boardrooms and command structures and people who jumped when she gave orders. Nathan watched the ambulance drive away, its lights flashing, but its sirens silent, and felt something cold settle in his stomach. He knew that voice, not the specific sound of it, but the tone, the confidence, the absolute certainty that the world would bend to accommodate her will. He had heard voices like that in meetings where his warnings were dismissed, in conference rooms, where men in expensive suits decided that profit mattered more than safety. Frank appeared at his shoulder, 2 cups of coffee in his weathered hands, steam rising into the cool morning air. He offered one to Nathan without a word, and they stood together watching the emergency vehicles and personnel that had transformed the peaceful valley into something resembling a disaster movie set. Ethan had finally released his grip on Nathan's leg and now sat on the dock's edge, his book about airplanes forgotten beside him as he watched the Coast Guard divers work to mark the crash site with fluorescent buoys. Frank kept his words low, meant only for Nathan. "You did a hell of a thing today. Most folks would have stood on this dock and watched, called 911 and waited for someone else to handle it. You jumped in." Nathan's response carried no pride. Anyone would have done the same. Frank's laugh was short and humorless, the sound of a man who had seen too much of human nature to believe in its inherent goodness. "No, they wouldn't have. Trust me on that one. I've seen what people do when the chips are down, and most of them look out for themselves first and everyone else never." The old man paused, taking a long sip of his coffee before continuing in a tone that carried unexpected weight. "You remind me of your father, you know. He was the same way. Couldn't walk past a problem without trying to fix it, even when fixing it meant trouble for himself. I never met a man with less regard for his own well-being when someone else needed help." Nathan stiffened at the mention of his father. He had never told Frank about his family history, had maintained the careful distance of a man who wanted to be known for nothing more than his competence with engines and his quiet demeanor. The revelation that Frank knew something about his past sent a thread of unease winding through his chest. Frank seemed to sense his discomfort and raised a hand in a gesture of peace. "Relax, I met your father once years ago at a timber convention in Billings. He was there selling custom furniture, and I was there looking for chainsaw parts. We got to talking, and he mentioned he had a son who was some kind of genius with machines. Showed me a picture of you must have been about 12 years old. When you showed up here 6 years ago, I recognized the resemblance. Never said anything because you seemed like a man who wanted his privacy. Nathan's throat tightened. His father had died the year before Sarah, taken by a heart attack in his workshop, surrounded by half-finished projects and sawdust in the accumulated silence of a life lived mostly alone. Nathan had driven to Montana for the funeral, stood beside a grave in a cemetery overlooking the valley where he had grown up, and felt nothing but the cold emptiness of losing the last connection to his childhood. He had not known his father carried a picture of him, had not known the old man talked about him to strangers at conventions, had not known that pride had ever been part of their complicated relationship. Frank drained the last of his coffee and set the empty cup on a fence post, his eyes still fixed on the activity at the crash site. Your father told me something that day that stuck with me. He said you can build a house from rotten wood if you want to. It'll look fine for a while, might even hold up through a storm or two. But eventually the truth of what's inside will come out, and everything you built on that bad foundation will come crashing down. He said he tried to teach you to always build with honest materials, even when it cost more, even when it took longer. Said it was the only way to make something that would last. Nathan said nothing, but the words settled into him like stones dropping into still water, sending ripples through memories he had tried to forget. His father had been a hard man, sparing with praise and generous with criticism, but he had built things that lasted. The boat Nathan fished from had survived 4 decades and would survive 4 more. There was a lesson there that Nathan had absorbed without ever consciously acknowledging it, a foundation for the principles that had made him speak up when everyone else stayed silent and had cost him everything as a result. The investigators arrived as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the mountain peaks. A woman in a severe gray suit introduced herself as representing the National Transportation Safety Board, and a man with a face that suggested decades of examining wreckage said he was from the Federal Aviation Administration. They took Nathan's statement with professional detachment, recording every detail of what he had seen and done. They asking questions that probed the edges of his account without quite crossing into accusation. How close was he to the crash site when the plane went down? Did he notice anything unusual about the aircraft before impact? Had he ever seen this particular plane before? Did he know the identity of the woman he had rescued? Nathan answered truthfully and briefly, volunteering nothing beyond what was directly asked. No, he had not known the woman. No, he had not seen the plane before. Yes, he had been approximately 200 meters from the impact site fishing with his son. Yes, he had military training in water rescue from a brief stint in the Navy before his aerospace career. No, he had no idea what had caused the crash. He was simply a man who had been in the right place at the right time and had done what needed to be done. The investigators thanked him for his cooperation and left their vehicles kicking up dust on the dirt road that led back to the main highway. Frank had taken Ethan into town for ice cream, a transparent attempt to give Nathan space to deal with the officials without worrying about his son overhearing difficult questions. The gesture was typical of the old man's quiet thoughtfulness, and Nathan made a mental note to thank him properly when he returned. The valley fell silent as the last of the emergency vehicles departed, leaving behind nothing but tire tracks in the dirt and a fading smell of diesel exhaust. The smoke from the crash site had dissipated and the lake had returned to its usual glassy stillness, as if nothing extraordinary had happened at all. Nathan stood on his porch, a fresh cup of coffee cooling in his hands, and stared at the water that had nearly claimed 2 lives that morning. His reflection stared back at him, distorted by ripples that the evening breeze sent skating across the surface, and he wondered if the woman he had saved would remember his face, or if he would simply become an anonymous footnote in the story of her survival. That night, after Ethan had been fed and bathed and tucked into bed with his book about airplanes clutched to his chest, Nathan sat alone in the cabin's small living room and let himself remember. He did not do this often. The past was a locked room in his mind, and he had good reasons for keeping the door firmly closed. But the events of the day had picked the lock somehow, and memories began seeping through the cracks, like water finding its way through a dam that was never as strong as it appeared. 6 years ago, Nathan Mercer had been someone else entirely. He had been Dr. Nathan Mercer, senior aerospace engineer at Sterling Aerospace, holder of 3 patents and author of 12 peer-reviewed papers on hydraulic control systems. He had worn expensive suits and driven a German sedan and lived in a house in the Berkeley Hills with a view of the bay and a mortgage that would take 30 years to pay off. He had been married to Sarah, a woman whose smile could light up any room she entered, and whose faith in him had never wavered, even when his own faith in himself had faltered. They had a son together, a bright-eyed boy who had just learned to say daddy and who looked at Nathan with an adoration that felt both wonderful and terrifying. Nathan had loved his work at Sterling with a passion that bordered on obsession. The company developed experimental aircraft systems so advanced that some of them did not even have official names yet, designated only by alphanumeric codes that meant nothing to anyone outside the classified programs. He spent his days in laboratories and simulation rooms, surrounded by equipment that cost more than most people would earn in a lifetime solving problems that pushed the boundaries of what was physically possible. His colleagues respected him. His supervisors praised him. His future at the company seemed as certain as the sunrise. Then he had seen something that no one wanted him to see. It happened during a routine inspection of a hydraulic control system destined for installation in a new generation of business jets. Nathan was reviewing test data comparing actual performance metrics against theoretical predictions when he noticed an anomaly that made his blood run cold. The system was failing under sustained high-stress conditions at a rate that exceeded acceptable parameters by a factor of 3. Not dramatically, but consistently, a pattern that would be invisible to anyone who was not specifically looking for it. The failures occurred in a component that was buried deep within the system architecture, a pressure valve that would behave normally under standard operating conditions, but would crack and eventually rupture when subjected to the kind of continuous stress that occurred during extended flights or emergency maneuvers. Nathan ran the numbers 3 times, certain he had made a mistake somewhere in his calculations. But the math did not lie. The valve was defective not through any fault in manufacturing, but through a fundamental flaw in the design itself. The material specifications called for an alloy that could not withstand the pressure cycles the system would experience in real-world conditions. It was the kind of error that happened when schedules were rushed and corners were cut, when the pressure to deliver results outweighed the imperative to deliver them safely. He brought his findings to his immediate supervisor, a man named Gerald Whitmore, who had risen through the ranks by telling people what they wanted to hear, rather than what they needed to know. Gerald's office smelled of expensive cologne and featured a golf trophy on the desk that he polished every morning before checking his emails. Nathan laid out the data, explained the implications, recommended an immediate halt to production until the flaw could be addressed. Gerald smiled his too wide smile and clapped Nathan on the shoulder with a familiarity that felt condescending rather than collegial. Gerald's words had been smooth as oil practiced at delivering unwelcome messages in packages that appeared to contain something else entirely. "I appreciate you bringing this to my attention, Nathan. Really, I do. It shows the kind of attention to detail that makes you such a valuable member of our team. But I think you might be overreacting just a bit here. These systems go through extensive testing before they're ever installed in an aircraft. Any problems would be caught long before they became dangerous." Nathan had pushed back, struggling to remain professional. The testing protocols don't stress the valve under sustained high-load conditions. They simulate individual events, not cumulative wear. By the time the problem becomes apparent, planes will already be in service. People will be flying on systems that could fail without warning. Gerald's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered behind his eyes. "I hear your concerns, and I promise they'll be taken into consideration. But decisions like this are above both our pay grades. Let me escalate it to the appropriate people, and we'll see what they say. In the meantime, I'd appreciate it if you kept this between us. No need to alarm anyone unnecessarily." Nathan had agreed, believing that the proper channels would address the problem once the right people were made aware. He returned to his work, checked and rechecked his calculations, compiled additional data that supported his conclusions, and waited for word that the issue was being addressed. Days passed, then weeks. Gerald stopped mentioning the matter entirely, and when Nathan raised it again, he was met with vague assurances that it was being handled and gentle suggestions that he focus on his other responsibilities. The first email went out 3 weeks after the initial discovery. Nathan sent it to Gerald, documenting his concerns in writing so there would be no ambiguity about what he had observed and what he believed the appropriate response should be. He received no reply. A week later, he sent a second email, this one copied to Gerald's supervisor, a vice president named Margaret Chen, who had always struck Nathan as someone who took safety concerns seriously. Margaret replied with a brief acknowledgement and a promise to look into the matter. Then nothing. Nathan sent a third email, then a fourth, each one more detailed than the last, each one copied to additional recipients higher in the organizational hierarchy. He included test data failure simulations, statistical projections of the likely consequences if the flawed systems were deployed. He wrote in language that was professional but urgent, the careful phrasing of a man who understood the politics of large organizations but believed that the weight of evidence would eventually overcome institutional inertia. The fifth email went to Marcus Sterling himself, the executive vice president who had transformed his brother's modest engineering firm into an aerospace giant. Nathan had never met Marcus personally, but the man's reputation preceded him. Brilliant, ruthless, and utterly devoted to the company's bottom line. Marcus Sterling was the driving force behind decisions that had made Sterling Aerospace a dominant player in the industry. If anyone had the authority to stop production and address the flaw, it was him. The reply came not from Marcus, but from a lawyer in the company's legal department, a politely worded reminder that Nathan's employment contract contained confidentiality provisions that prohibited him from discussing proprietary technical information outside approved channels. The letter did not specifically threaten him, but the implication was clear enough that Nathan had to read it 3 times before the full meaning sank in. He was being warned to back off his concerns, dismissed not through argument, but through intimidation. Nathan did not back off. He sent a 6th email, this one requesting a formal meeting to discuss the safety implications of the hydraulic system. He sent a 7th email when the meeting request went unanswered, attaching a 47-page technical report that documented every aspect of the flaw and its potential consequences. He had spent 3 weeks writing that report, nights and weekends stolen from time with Sarah and Ethan, driven by a conviction that surely someone would listen if only he could make the case clearly enough. 3 months after his initial discovery, a test flight was scheduled over the Nevada desert. The aircraft was a prototype equipped with the same hydraulic control system Nathan had been warning about, and the test was designed to push the plane to its operational limits. Nathan requested permission to attend the test as an observer, citing his expertise in the relevant systems. Permission was denied without explanation. He learned later that the denial had come directly from Marcus Sterling's office, though no one would confirm this on the record. Sarah attended the test instead. It was a tradition at Sterling Aerospace for family members to observe major tests from a purpose-built observation tower, located at a safe distance from the runway. The tower featured climate-controlled viewing areas, refreshment stations, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered unobstructed views of the test site. It was considered a perk of employment, a chance for loved ones to see the cutting-edge technology their family members helped create. Sarah had been excited about the trip, packing Ethan's favorite snacks and buying a new camera to capture the moment when the sleek experimental aircraft took to the sky. Nathan was at headquarters in San Francisco when the call came. He had been in a meeting reviewing budgets for the next quarter when his phone buzzed with a number he did not recognize. He excused himself and stepped into the hallway to answer, expecting a telemarketer or a wrong number, never imagining that the next few seconds would divide his life into before and after. The voice on the other end belonged to the site manager at the Nevada facility, a man Nathan had met briefly at a company function years earlier. The voice was trembling, barely controlled, struggling to form words that clearly did not want to be spoken. "There's been an explosion. The observation tower collapsed. We're doing everything we can, but I need to tell you, your wife and son were in the tower. Emergency services are on scene. You should come immediately." Nathan drove 3 hours straight from headquarters to Nevada, breaking every speed limit and ignoring every traffic law, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his fingers went numb. The entire time he kept thinking the same thoughts over and over, a desperate mantra against the reality that was rushing toward him with the inevitability of a freight train. "She's fine. Sarah has to be fine. She's just waiting for me." When he arrived, the observation tower was nothing but rubble. The west wall, where families had stood to watch the test flight through the floor-to-ceiling windows, had collapsed completely when the shock wave from the mid-air explosion reached the structure. The engineers had calculated that the tower was far enough from the runway to be safe from any conceivable accident, but they had not accounted for a catastrophic hydraulic failure that sent the aircraft spinning out of control and directly toward the observation area before it exploded in a ball of fire and metal fragments. Sarah had been standing at those windows when the wall came down. She had been bending down, whispering something into Ethan's ear, probably pointing out some feature of the aircraft or explaining what was about to happen. The 3-year-old had been excited, his small hand pressed against the glass, his eyes wide with wonder at the sleek machine on the runway below. Sarah had been smiling. Nathan was certain of that, even though no one who survived could confirm it. She was always smiling when she was with Ethan, her joy and motherhood evident in every moment they spent together. The shockwave hit the tower less than a second after the explosion. The glass shattered inward, and the wall followed tons of concrete and steel collapsing onto the people who had gathered to watch something that was supposed to be safe, something that was supposed to demonstrate the brilliant achievements of American aerospace engineering, something that was never supposed to go wrong. Ethan survived because Sarah had pulled him into her arms at the last possible moment, using her own body to shield him from the falling debris. First responders found the boy crying beneath his mother's body, scratched and bruised but alive, protected by a sacrifice that had taken less than a second to make and would define the rest of his life. Sarah had not survived. The medical examiner said later that death had been instantaneous, that she would not have suffered, but Nathan found no comfort in this. She had died because he had not been loud enough, persistent enough, convincing enough to make someone listen to his warnings. Nathan had knelt beside his wife's body amid the rubble, his hands trembling as he touched her face still warm as if she were only sleeping. But there was no breath, no heartbeat, no flutter of eyelids that would signal a return from unconscious depths. She was gone as completely and irrevocably as if she had never existed at all. The woman who had believed in him when no one else did, who had told him every morning that he would change the world, who had given him a son and a home and a reason to get up every day, lay broken in the desert dust while their child whimpered beside her. Ethan's voice had been small, bewildered, the voice of a child too young to understand what he was seeing. "Daddy, what's wrong with Mommy? Will she get up?" Nathan could not answer. He gathered his son into his arms and held him tight, held him as hard as he could, and let the tears fall for the first time in years. He cried for Sarah. He cried for Ethan. He cried for himself and for the future that had just been torn away from all of them. And somewhere beneath the grief, a rage began to build, cold and hard and patient, directed at the people who had ignored his warnings and let this happen. The next day, Nathan submitted his resignation. There was no severance package, no ceremony, no acknowledgement of his years of service or his contributions to the company's success. There was only a cold conference room, fluorescent lights that buzzed like angry insects, and a row of expensive suits on the other side of a long table. The HR director spoke in a flat, practiced tone, reciting words that had clearly been prepared by lawyers. "Mr. Mercer, we understand your grief, but we must address your continued sharing of personal views on technical matters. This behavior is negatively affecting company morale and could expose the company to liability." Nathan's response came out as little more than a strangled whisper. "Personal views. I warned you 7 times. 7 separate warnings. I have the data. I have the inspection reports. My wife is dead because you ignored them." The man at the head of the table had not been the HR director. It had been Marcus Sterling, himself silver-haired and immaculate, his expression carrying a small smile that never reached his eyes. He wore a navy suit that probably cost more than Nathan's monthly mortgage payment, and his fingers were interlaced on the table in front of him in a posture of calm authority that seemed almost obscene given the circumstances. Marcus's tone had been smooth, controlled, the voice of a man who had delivered bad news so many times that it no longer caused him even the smallest twinge of discomfort. "Mr. Mercer, we conducted a full investigation. The explosion resulted from multiple unforeseeable factors. There was no negligence on the company's part. What happened was a tragedy, and we extend our deepest condolences, but we will not accept responsibility for circumstances beyond our control." Nathan had shot to his feet, slamming his hand on the table with a force that made the water glasses tremble. "No negligence. I wrote a 47-page report. I ran failure simulations. I sent you 7 emails warning that exactly this would happen if you didn't fix the valve. I have records of every single warning I sent and every single time you ignored them. Marcus raised a hand, cutting him off with the casual authority of a man who was accustomed to being obeyed. Enough. You have two options, Mr. Mercer. One, sign this agreement, accept compensation, and remain silent about anything related to your employment here. Two, we will protect the company's reputation through any legal means necessary. And I assure you, with your current emotional state and your history of raising unfounded concerns, you will never work in aerospace again. No one will hire an engineer who makes wild accusations against his previous employer. Your career will be over. Nathan looked down at the stack of papers in front of him. Numbers with far too many zeros, a sum painted in blood, compensation for the loss of his wife that reduced her life to a line item on a corporate balance sheet. Then he thought of Ethan, his 3-year-old boy, staying with a babysitter who did not know how to explain why mommy was not coming home. The boy needed a father. He needed someone who would survive, not someone bent on self-destruction in a battle he could not win against enemies with unlimited resources and no conscience. Nathan signed. His hand shook so badly that the signature wavered like the ink of a stranger, a mark that bore no resemblance to the confident script he had used on patents and publications and marriage certificates. As his pen lifted from the paper, he felt something inside him, a belief in justice that had sustained him through years of education and work and the daily struggles of building a career in a competitive industry. Marcus collected the documents with the satisfied air of a man who had just won a difficult negotiation. A wise decision, Mr. Mercer. And remember, this agreement is permanent. One careless comment, one social media post, one interview with a reporter, and we will sue you into bankruptcy. Every word you speak about Sterling Aerospace for the rest of your life is covered by this contract. That was the last time Nathan ever set foot in Sterling Aerospace. He packed his personal belongings from his office into a single cardboard box, carried it to his car under the watchful eyes of security guards who had been assigned to escort him from the building, and drove away from everything he had worked to build. The house in Berkeley went up for sale the following week. The German sedan was traded for a used pickup truck that would handle mountain roads. The patents and publications went into storage boxes that Nathan knew he would never open again. He put Ethan, not yet 3 years old, in the car and drove north. He drove until pavement became gravel, then gravel became dirt, then dirt became a pair of tire tracks leading to a cabin beside a lake that did not appear on most maps. He bought the place with what remained of their savings, signing papers in a lawyer's office, in a small town where no one asked questions about why a man with a prestigious career would want to disappear into the wilderness. There was no internet at the cabin, and cell service was spotty unless he climbed halfway up the hill behind the property. There was only a wood-burning stove, a small wooden dock, and a view of the lake stretching for miles in every direction. Nathan repaired engines for people in the area, lawnmowers, chainsaws, occasionally someone's old pickup truck that had developed a problem too complex for the shade tree mechanics in town. He learned the names of his neighbors, but kept them at a careful distance, polite but never friendly, available but never intimate. He taught Ethan how to fish, how to read the sky for wind patterns, how to build a fire that would burn steadily through a cold mountain night. He taught the boy kindness even when the world was not kind, patience even when circumstances demanded speed, honesty even when lies would be easier. At night, after Ethan fell asleep, Nathan sat under lantern light and turned the pages of old engineering textbooks, not because he still longed for the work, but because he could not forget it. The equations remained beautiful to him, the elegant logic of physics and mathematics that governed how things moved and why they sometimes failed. He reread his own papers, the ones he had written before everything fell apart, and marveled at the confidence that radiated from every sentence. That man, the man who had believed that truth and diligence would always be rewarded, seemed like a stranger now. The scar on Nathan's wrist, thin and pale, always reminded him of the system that had betrayed him. He had gotten it the night after signing the settlement, sitting alone in the empty Berkeley house with a bottle of whiskey and a kitchen knife, contemplating an end to pain that seemed to have no other solution. Ethan's cry from the other room had stopped him before he could do more than break the skin, a thin red line that became a permanent reminder of how close he had come to leaving his son completely alone in the world. He bandaged the wound himself, never seeking medical attention that might lead to questions, and the scar had faded over the years, until it was barely visible unless you knew where to look. Now, 6 years later, the small wooden cabin once again echoed with the peaceful sounds of a life slowly rebuilding itself. Ethan's laughter rang through the rooms as he played with models and read his endless books. The wood-burning stove crackled with warmth on cold nights. Pages rustled as Nathan worked through technical manuals that kept his mind sharp, even if they would never again be applied to actual engineering problems. It was not the life Nathan had dreamed of, not the future he had imagined, when he stood at the altar, watching Sarah walk toward him in a dress that made her look like an angel descended from heaven. But it was the life he had, and he had learned to find contentment in its simplicity. He did not know that the woman he had dragged from the cockpit yesterday was hunting the person responsible for nearly killing her. He did not know that her survival would set into motion a chain of events that no one would be able to stop. He did not know that the past he had tried so hard to bury was about to claw its way back to the surface. Demanding a reckoning that he had spent 6 years avoiding. The morning after the crash, Nathan stood in the small kitchen, making coffee with the old pot that had once belonged to his father. Sunlight filtered through the lace curtains that Sarah had hung there 6 years ago, the only decorative touch she had been able to add to the cabin before everything ended, scattering soft streaks of light across the wooden table. The cabin carried the faint scent of pine and old paper, the comforting smell of a home that had weathered decades of mountain seasons. In the corner, a small television sat on a shelf broadcasting news that Nathan rarely watched, but that he had turned on this morning out of a vague sense of obligation to know what was being said about the event he had witnessed. The screen showed aerial footage of the crash site rescue boats circling the area, divers plunging into water that had swallowed the wreckage Coast Guard helicopters sweeping across the lake's surface. A headline crawled across the bottom of the screen in bold letters, "Billionaire CEO survives plane crash." Nathan reached for the remote and turned off the television before the announcer could say the woman's name. He did not want to know. He did not need to know. In his experience, people labeled as heroes rarely got happy endings. They only dragged more trouble behind them, attracting attention that inevitably led to scrutiny questions, the unraveling of carefully maintained privacy. He had saved a life, and that was enough. Whatever story the news was constructing around the event, he wanted no part of it. He poured the coffee and glanced out the window toward the lake. The water was calm again, still as glass, as if yesterday had never happened. No explosion. No airplane tearing through the sky and falling right before their eyes. No desperate swim through fuel-slicked water to reach the stranger who was running out of time. The lake had absorbed the violence and returned to its peaceful state, indifferent to human drama, ancient and patient as the mountains that surrounded it. But Nathan knew one thing well. Some scars never smooth out again. The surface might heal, might present a face to the world that looked normal and whole, but underneath the damage remained. Ethan wandered into the kitchen, still in his pajamas, hair sticking up in all directions. The boy had slept poorly. Nathan knew kept awake by dreams of falling airplanes and his father disappearing into dark water. He had climbed into Nathan's bed around 3 a.m, seeking comfort that Nathan had given freely, even though his own sleep suffered as a result. Some things mattered more than rest. Some fears required presence rather than words. The boy's words were small, still carrying the weight of yesterday's terror. "Dad is the lady, okay, the one you saved?" Nathan set down his coffee cup and crouched to meet his son's eyes. "She's okay. She went to the hospital to make sure, but she's going to be fine." Ethan nodded, processing this information with the seriousness that characterized his approach to most things. Then he asked the question Nathan had been dreading. Why did the plane fall? Planes aren't supposed to fall. Nathan paused, considering how much truth a 9-year-old could handle, how much truth he was willing to share with anyone, even his own son. Finally, he settled on an answer that was incomplete, but not dishonest. Sometimes machines break even when we don't expect them to. It's rare, but it happens. The important thing is that people know how to respond when it does. That's why I went into the water. Because someone needed help, and I knew how to give it. The answer seemed to satisfy Ethan, at least temporarily. The boy wandered toward the refrigerator in search of breakfast, his attention already shifting to more immediate concerns. Nathan watched him go, feeling the familiar mixture of love and fear that defined fatherhood. He had not been able to save Sarah. That failure would haunt him until the day he died. But he could save Ethan, could protect him from the worst of what the world had to offer, could raise him to be good and kind and strong enough to face whatever challenges life presented. The roar of engines rose from the dirt road around 10 a.m. Nathan was standing in the yard splitting logs on the chopping block, his flannel sleeves rolled up despite the lingering early spring chill in the air. The physical work helped quiet his mind, the repetitive motion of lifting the axe and bringing it down, providing a focus that kept darker thoughts at bay. Inside the house, Ethan sat at the kitchen table, absorbed in his airplane model glue and balsa sticks, scattered across the surface like a miniature battlefield of the boy's making. The engine noise grew louder, a deep rumble that was completely out of place in the quiet of the mountains. Nathan set the axe down and wiped his hands on his jeans, his heartbeat quickening without his permission. Visitors were rare at the cabin, and unexpected visitors were rarer still. The dirt road that led to his property was not on any maps, not part of any route that casual travelers might take. Anyone who came here had a reason, and reasons usually meant complications. Then 3 sleek black Cadillacs glided out from between the pines, sunlight hitting the car roofs and making them shine like obsidian mirrors. Dust rose in blurred ribbons behind them, drifting through beams of light and slipping between the branches of the surrounding trees. The vehicles moved in formation, smooth and confident, the kind of convoy that spoke of money and power, and the assumption that doors would open wherever they arrived. Nathan felt his muscles tense. He recognized this kind of arrival, remembered the black cars that had circled his Berkeley house in the days after Sarah's death, lawyers and executives and damage control specialists descending like vultures on a carcass. The memory brought with it a surge of old anger, hot and bitter, that he forced himself to suppress. Whatever this was, losing his temper would not help. The lead car stopped only a few meters from the porch. The door opened and a woman stepped out. She was tall, somewhere in her mid-40s, her black hair tied into a neat ponytail that emphasized the sharp features of her face. She wore a navy blazer and matching trousers that probably cost more than Nathan's entire wardrobe, the kind of clothing that proclaimed success to anyone with eyes to see it. A faint bruise still shadowed her temple, and a white bandage on her jaw stood out against her pale skin, souvenirs of the crash that Nathan had pulled her from less than 24 hours ago. But her eyes remained strong, steady, the eyes of someone accustomed to commanding attention and getting what she wanted. Victoria Sterling approached the heels of her shoes, crunching rhythmically on the gravel with each step. 2 assistants emerged from the cars behind her, both in black suits carrying leather folders and tablets. One of them held a thick envelope, the kind that contained either very good news or very bad news, depending on which side of the transaction you were standing. Victoria stopped in front of Nathan and extended her hand. Her handshake was firm and decisive, the kind that sealed deals and ended debates, communicating confidence that bordered on aggression. Her words were clear and composed, carrying easily across the space between them. "You saved my life yesterday. Then you disappeared before I had the chance to thank you. I wanted to do that in person." Nathan withdrew his hand slowly, his expression carefully neutral. "No need. I only did what anyone would do." Victoria's lips twitched slightly, not quite forming a smile. "Not everyone would. Most people would pull out their phones to record and post online before calling for help. You jumped into the water without hesitation. That's not common." One of the assistants stepped forward, lifting the envelope with both hands as though presenting something ceremonial. His delivery was practiced professional, the delivery of someone who had made this kind of offer before. "We'd like to compensate you for your bravery, and we also request that you sign a confidentiality agreement, standard procedure for incidents involving the company." Nathan did not take the envelope. He glanced toward the shimmering lake beyond the pines, then looked straight into Victoria's eyes. His words were low but firm, carrying a weight that came from somewhere deeper than simple refusal. "I don't want money, and I don't sign things like that anymore." Victoria tilted her head as though fitting a missing piece into a puzzle she had been working on since her arrival. There was something in Nathan's voice old and bitter, and suppressed to the point of being almost invisible, that did not match the simple mountain man his appearance suggested. Her next question came with the precision of someone accustomed to extracting information. "You don't want to know why my plane went down." Nathan's response was immediate. "Not my business." Victoria pressed forward, watching the small shifts in his expression with an attention that missed nothing. "It could have been sabotage. The FAA is investigating. Someone may have interfered with the hydraulic system." Nathan's jaw tightened just for a moment, just enough to be visible to someone who was looking for exactly that reaction. The words hydraulic system hung in the air between them like a blade suspended by a thread. Victoria saw the change in him, the way his shoulders stiffened and his eyes flickered with something that might have been recognition or might have been old pain resurfacing. She glanced toward the open doorway of the cabin. From where she stood, she could see simple, sturdy furnishings arranged with military precision. Firewood stacked neatly beside the stove, ready for the cold nights that still came even in spring at this elevation. A photo on the wall showing a woman holding a child, both of them smiling with the unguarded happiness of people who did not know what the future held. And next to it, pinned to a corkboard, technical diagrams that drew her attention like a magnet. Victoria stepped closer, narrowing her eyes at the nearest corner of the blueprint. The diagrams were detailed schematics, clean, precise lines, correct symbols, exact measurements, neat handwriting in the margins. The kind of work that came from professional training, not amateur enthusiasm. And in the corner, a logo that made her breath catch in her throat, Sterling Aerospace. She turned back to Nathan. His face was calm as a still lake, but his shoulders carried all the tension underneath the posture of a man holding himself together through force of will alone. Victoria felt something shift in on her, a piece of a puzzle she had not known she was assembling, sliding into place with an almost audible click. They stood there in silence. No sound, no words, just two people recognizing something in each other that neither had expected to find. Then Ethan peeked out from the doorway, curious and unaware of the tension in the air. He clutched his airplane model in his hands, the same model he had been working on all morning, and his eyes moved from his father to the strange woman with the bruised face and expensive clothes. The boy's question was innocent, uncomplicated, by the histories that the adults carried. "Dad, who are they?" Nathan's expression softened immediately, the tension draining from his face as he turned to address his son, "Just passing visitors. Go back inside." Ethan nodded and retreated into the cabin. Victoria watched the door close behind him, then turned back to Nathan. Something had shifted in her gaze, perhaps recognition, perhaps empathy, perhaps the beginning of a connection neither of them wanted, but neither could deny. She gave a small, slow nod as if a piece had finally clicked into place. "Thank you again, Mr. Mercer." She addressed him by name for the first time, and Nathan felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the mountain air. She knew who he was. She had done her research before coming here, had looked into the man who pulled her from the wreckage, had discovered connections that he had spent 6 years trying to sever. Victoria continued, her tone softer than before. "If you ever need anything, you know how to find me." She did not wait for his response. She turned and walked back to her car with the same confident stride that had brought her across the gravel, every step communicating control and purpose. All three Cadillacs reversed down the narrow road, their engines humming like the breath of some large creature, then vanished behind the pines as quickly and quietly as they had arrived. Ethan stepped onto the porch, watching the fading trail of dust that marked their departure. His words carried the simple curiosity of a child who did not yet understand that some questions had complicated answers. "Dad, why did she come all the way out here just to say thank you?" Nathan watched the dust settle, his thoughts churning with implications he did not want to examine. Finally, he offered the only answer he could give without explaining everything he had spent 6 years hiding. "She's from another world, Ethan, not ours." But even as he said the words, he knew things were no longer simple. The past he had buried was stirring, reaching toward him with fingers made of memory and consequence, and he was not at all certain he could push it back into its grave. By late afternoon, the story had spread throughout the valley and then far beyond its quiet borders. But it was not the simple version of a man saving a life and disappearing back into anonymity. It was the distorted, sensationalized version, the one that sold advertisements and generated clicks and turned ordinary events into lurid entertainment for people who would never meet the individuals involved. Someone had leaked video of the crash, a blurry clip recorded on the phone of a hiker on the mountainside, someone who had happened to raise their camera at the exact moment the plane went down. The footage showed the impact, the column of water exploding upward like a plume of white fireworks, and a tiny figure swimming toward the wreckage with a determination that seemed almost foolhardy. Within hours, the video had gone wildly viral, shared and reshared across platforms that Nathan had never used and never intended to use. News outlets clawed at the footage like predators fighting over a carcass. Bloggers analyzed every frame, looking for details that could support their chosen narratives. And then the headlines began to appear. each one more poisonous than the last spinning stories that bore no resemblance to what had actually happened. Hero or mastermind suspicious proximity in CEO rescue. Billionaire crash was she lured to a remote lake. The reclusive mountain man, what is he hiding? They spun bizarre narratives that seemed designed to provoke rather than inform. A man living alone in the woods, no employment records, no digital footprint. A woman crashing right onto his land, too convenient in their eyes. The valley that had been Nathan's refuge for 6 years in a single night had become a sprung trap. Reporters poured in by midday, renting rooms at the town motel, lining news vans along the main road, knocking on doors for quotes from anyone who might have something to say about the mysterious hermit who had pulled a billionaire from a burning plane. They offered money for interviews, promised anonymity for anyone willing to share gossip, created an atmosphere of siege that transformed the quiet community into something resembling a war zone. Frank Patterson's general store quickly became the epicenter of the invasion. Cameras set up outside journalists buying coffee just to ask every customer whether they knew who Nathan Mercer really was, what his background might be, whether he had ever said anything suspicious about wealthy people or airplanes or anything that could be twisted into evidence for the conspiracy theories that were already taking shape online. Frank called Nathan around 2 in the afternoon, his words full of confusion and guilt. "Nathan, I'm sorry. They're saying awful things, and people are starting to believe them. I'm doing what I can to shut it down, but these vultures don't listen to anything that doesn't fit their story." Nathan thanked him and hung up. There was nothing left to say. The machine had started turning, and once it started, there was no way to stop it from grinding whatever it caught in its gears. At the garage where Nathan worked part-time, Bill Hendricks pulled him aside near the end of the day. Bill was a good man, one of the few who had given Nathan a chance when he first arrived in the valley, with no references and no explanation for why an obviously educated man wanted to spend his days elbow deep in engine grease. His eyes were sincere but firm, carrying the regret of someone about to do something he did not want to do. Bill's words came out heavy, weighted with reluctance. "Nathan, I don't buy into any of those rumors. Not for a second. But customers are getting uneasy. Some of them are asking questions I can't answer. I think it's best if you take some time off just until things settle down. I'll hold your position, but I can't have you here while this circus is going on." Nathan did not argue. He understood the calculation Bill was making, the same calculation that business owners everywhere made when public opinion turned against someone associated with their enterprise. It was not fair, but fairness had stopped being relevant to Nathan's life a long time ago. He packed his tools into the box, each item placed with care, despite the turmoil in his chest movements worn into him from thousands of repetitions. His hands were steady, but his jaw was tight, and he did not trust himself to speak without saying something he would regret. He walked out to his truck without looking back, climbed into the driver's seat, and sat there for a long moment before turning the key in the ignition. Through the windshield, he could see people watching him, some with sympathy, and some with the hungry curiosity that tragedy always seemed to inspire. He started the engine and drove away, leaving behind the one place outside his cabin where he had felt useful and wanted. That evening, when he stopped to buy bread and milk for Ethan at the small grocery store at the edge of town, Nathan felt the eyes following him. The whispers trailed behind him like shadows seeping through every aisle, impossible to escape, even in the brief minutes it took to gather the few items on his list. A woman pushing a cart pulled her daughter closer the moment Nathan walked past, as though he were a threat rather than a neighbor she had smiled at dozens of times over the years. Near the checkout, a man in a work jacket spoke loudly to his companion, making no effort to lower his voice despite Nathan's obvious presence. No one just happens to be there when a billionaire's plane crashes. He must have planned the whole thing. Probably set up some kind of trap to bring her down so he could play hero. These quiet types are always the ones you have to watch out for. Nathan set his basket down on the counter and walked out empty-handed. The clerk called after him, but he did not turn around. He could not be in that space for another second, could not breathe the same air as people who had decided he was guilty of something without bothering to learn the first fact about who he actually was or what he had actually done. The drive back to the cabin took longer than usual. Nathan pulled over twice, once to compose himself when his hands started shaking too badly to hold the steering wheel safely, and once to stare at the lake in the fading light, remembering a time when its beauty had been enough to quiet the chaos in his mind. Tonight it was not enough. Tonight, the memories were too close, the parallels too obvious, the feeling of persecution too familiar. That night, rain hammered steadily against the cabin roof. The sound was rhythmic, almost hypnotic, like a mournful drum, marking time that Nathan wished would stop passing. Ethan sat at the kitchen table poking at his dinner. Without enthusiasm, his eyes red from crying he had tried to hide and failed. The boy had heard things at school, classmates repeating what their parents had said, questions that he did not know how to answer because he did not understand why anyone would ask them. Ethan's words were small when he finally spoke, barely above a whisper. "Dad, why are people saying you're bad?" Nathan looked at his son across the table, feeling his heart crack along fault lines he had thought were fully healed. Ethan had lost his mother before he could remember her face. He had never asked for anything except a peaceful life, a home where he could read his books and build his models and feel safe. And now even that modest wish was crumbling because Nathan had done the right thing, because he had jumped into water when someone needed help, because the world punished kindness just as readily as it punished truth. Nathan wanted to explain everything. He wanted to tell Ethan that the world preferred entertaining lies over boring truths, that people believed what they wanted to believe because it was easier than thinking that media existed to generate outrage rather than understanding. But he could not say all of that to a 9-year-old. He could not burden his son with the weight of cynicism that he himself carried. So he reached across the table and took Ethan's hand, offering comfort that he was not certain he could provide. His words came out gentler than he felt, shaped by the need to protect rather than the desire to vent. Sometimes people are afraid of things they don't understand, son. They see something unusual and they make up stories to explain it, even when the stories aren't true. This will pass. The news will find something else to talk about, and everyone will forget about us. Ethan looked down at his plate, his small fingers curling around Nathan's larger hand. "Will it really pass, Dad?" Nathan did not answer. He could not promise something he himself did not believe. He had made that mistake before, had assured Sarah that his warnings would be heard and acted upon, had believed that truth and persistence would overcome institutional indifference. The promise had been hollow, and the consequences had been catastrophic. He would not make that same mistake with his son. He cleared the table, washed the dishes, and tucked Ethan into bed with more care than usual. The boy fell asleep, clutching his book about airplanes as he did every night, and Nathan sat beside him for a long time, watching the gentle rise and fall of his chest, marveling at the fact that something so precious could have emerged from circumstances so tragic. Sarah lived on in this boy, in his curious mind, and his capacity for wonder that the world had not yet managed to destroy. Nathan would protect that. Whatever else happened, whatever accusations were leveled, and whatever consequences followed, he would protect Ethan from the worst of it. He left the bedroom door slightly ajar, as Ethan preferred, and walked to the main room of the cabin. The rain continued to fall, streaming down the windows in rivulets that distorted the view of the night beyond. Nathan sat in the old armchair that had come with the cabin, staring at the darkness, letting his mind drift through memories he usually kept locked away. The thing that hurt him most was not the headlines. It was not the whispers or the suspicious glances or the way people he had known for years suddenly looked at him as though he were a stranger. It was Ethan's eyes, the eyes of a child looking at the father he loved with confusion and fear, because he did not understand why the man who taught him kindness, honesty, and doing the right thing was being treated like a criminal. That night, Nathan lay in bed staring at the ceiling, feeling the old scar on his wrist burning again. History was repeating itself. Once again, he had done the right thing, and once again, he was being punished for it, miles away in her office at Sterling Aerospace, Victoria. Sterling sat motionless before her computer screen. The building was empty except for security guards and the handful of executives who worked late hours as a matter of habit. The city lights of San Francisco sparkled through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind her, but Victoria saw none of it. Her attention was focused entirely on the file open before her, a personnel record that she had hesitated to access but could no longer ignore. The radar log of her flight was displayed on one monitor, a technical readout that meant nothing to untrained eyes, but that Victoria had learned to interpret during her years of studying every aspect of the company she ran. There was a gap in the data, a section that had been cut out clearly and deliberately. Someone had edited the flight records. Someone had removed evidence. And the only reason to do that was to hide something that would incriminate whoever was responsible for what had happened. Victoria opened the personnel database on another monitor. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard for a long moment, trembling slightly in a way that she would never have allowed anyone else to see. Then she typed the name she had been forcing herself not to think about since that morning, Nathan Mercer. The file loaded slowly each second, stretching out like an accusation. Then the lines of information appeared, each one cold as ink on ice. Employment dates. Position Senior Aerospace Engineer. Department Hydraulic Systems Development. Status terminated following incident review. Not eligible for rehire. A notation at the bottom added by someone in human resources warning future managers against considering this candidate for any position within the company. Victoria clicked deeper, opening attachments and linked documents, following a trail of breadcrumbs that led her further and further into territories she had never explored. An HR report from 6 years ago. A technical memorandum marked confidential. A chain of emails with subject lines that grew increasingly urgent as the dates progressed. She read them line by line, and the more she read, the paler her face became. Nathan had warned them. Not once, not twice, but 7 separate times over a period of 3 months. 7 emails documenting the same critical flaw in the hydraulic control system, each one more detailed than the last. Each one marked with the highest priority settings available in the company's internal communication system. He had sent them to his supervisor, then to his supervisor's supervisor, then to the vice president of engineering, then all the way to the executive level. He had attached test data, failure simulations, statistical projections that predicted exactly what would happen if the flawed systems were deployed. And each time he had received the same response. We will review this matter. The issue is under evaluation. Your concerns have been noted. But they had not reviewed. They had not evaluated. They had simply buried the warnings and continued production, choosing profit over safety, choosing to gamble with human lives rather than accept the financial consequences of a recall. 3 months after Nathan's first warning, the Nevada test flight had occurred. The explosion that killed his wife and nearly killed his son. One fatality recorded in the official incident report. Civilian observer, name redacted for privacy. Victoria opened the attachment to the incident file, and the name appeared like a blade slicing through the comfortable assumptions she had carried her entire life. Shira Mercer, wife of Nathan Mercer, mother of 1 child, dead at 34 because people in positions of power had decided that her life was worth less than the cost of fixing a defective valve. Victoria's hands trembled violently. She leaned back in her chair, eyes fixed on the screen, as though it had become a window into hell. The man who had saved her life was the man who had lost everything because of her company, because of her family, because decisions made in boardrooms she had walked through thousands of times had consequences that reached far beyond quarterly earnings reports and shareholder dividends. A knock on the door made her jolt. Victoria closed the file instantly, her hands moving with the reflexive speed of someone who had learned to hide her reactions in high-stakes environments. Her uncle Marcus Sterling walked in as he always did, without knocking first, without waiting for an invitation. 62 years old, silver-haired, dressed in a navy-tailored suit that fit a man who had dominated boardrooms for 3 decades. His smile was in place, the same smile he wore in every meeting, every negotiation, every encounter where he needed to project confidence and control. It was a smile that never reached his eyes. Marcus's tone was smooth, almost paternal. Working late again, Victoria. The doctor said you should be resting after what you have been through. Victoria forced her words into something neutral, suppressing the turmoil that threatened to surface. Just tracking the investigation progress on the crash. The FAA wants daily updates. It's time-consuming but necessary. Marcus stepped to the window, hands in his pivots, looking down at the city spread beneath them, like a kingdom awaiting orders. I heard you went to the valley yourself. To meet the man who pulled you out of the wreckage. Victoria kept her expression perfectly blank. I wanted to thank him in person. It seemed like the right thing to do. Marcus nodded slowly, still not turning from the window. Of course, very thoughtful of you, but you should be cautious, Victoria. People are already spinning stories. The more attention you draw to yourself, the more fuel you give to those who profit from chaos. Victoria swallowed her discomfort, keeping her words steady through force of will. He didn't do anything wrong. He saved my life. Marcus turned at last, his eyes sharp as ice despite the warmth in his voice. I believe that. Truly I do, but perception is what matters. You know that better than anyone. We can't control what actually happened, but we can control how the story is told. That's always been the key to managing difficult situations. Victoria felt something cold settle in her stomach, but her face did not betray a single millimeter of change. She was her father's daughter, trained from childhood in the art of maintaining composure when every instinct screamed for her to react. Marcus walked toward the door, one hand on the frame, then paused as though remembering something. "Oh, and I hope you're not digging through old personnel files. We have more important problems to focus on right now. The investigation, the media response, the insurance claims. There's no reason to get distracted by ancient history." The words drifted lightly through the air, but they carried an edge that Victoria recognized immediately. It was not a suggestion, it was a warning. She forced herself to respond with perfect calm, even as her heart raced in her chest. "Why would I do that?" Marcus smiled again, the same empty smile that had made her uncomfortable since childhood. "No reason at all. I just don't want you distracted by ghosts." Then he left his footsteps echoing down the hallway until they faded into silence. Victoria waited, counting her heartbeats, making certain he was truly gone before she moved again. Then she reopened the files, printed everything, stacked the documents neatly, and tucked them into her bag. She left the building in a thin drizzle that had begun sometime during her conversation with Marcus, her mind spinning with implications she was not yet ready to fully accept. The man who had saved her life had been destroyed by her company, by her family, by decisions made by people she had trusted, people she had worked beside for years without ever questioning whether they deserved that trust. Now she stood before a choice that would define who she was and what she believed in. She could bury the truth, protect the family name, preserve the empire that 3 generations of Sterlings had built. Or she could expose it and shatter everything from within. As she settled into the driver's seat of her car, watching raindrops hit the windshield like tiny needles, another thought slipped in, unwelcome but impossible to ignore. If Marcus knew she was investigating, if he knew what she had found, she would be the next target. Victoria started the engine. Headlights cut through the silvery gray rain. She drove home, but this time she checked her rearview mirror every few minutes. Maybe it was paranoia. Maybe she was overreacting, letting the trauma of the crash amplify every shadow into a threat. But a woman who had just survived a plane crash knew better than anyone that sometimes paranoia was the only reason you stayed alive. The night deepened around her as she navigated the rain-slicked streets, her thoughts churning with questions that had no easy answers. Who had tampered with her plane? Why had Marcus seemed so interested in what files she might be accessing? And what was she willing to sacrifice to find the truth? Behind her, somewhere in the darkness of the city, a car pulled away from the curb and followed at a careful distance, its headlights lost among the dozens of other vehicles still navigating the late-night streets. Victoria did not notice. She was too consumed by the documents in her bag, the files that proved her family's company had blood on its hands, the evidence that connected her survival to a tragedy she had never known existed. The rain continued to fall, washing the streets clean, even as it obscured the threats that moved through the shadows. Victoria Sterling had spent her entire career believing that doing the right thing and protecting her family were the same goal. Tonight, for the first time, she understood that she might have to choose between them. And somewhere in a cabin by a lake, Nathan Mercer lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rain, and wondering if the woman he had saved would bring salvation or destruction to the quiet life he had built from the ruins of his former existence. The call came at 9:43 in the evening. Nathan's old flip phone, the one he kept charged not out of necessity, but out of habit formed during years when emergencies could strike. Without warning, buzzed against the kitchen table with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet cabin. He had been sitting in the darkness, unable to sleep, watching the last embers die in the wood-burning stove, while rain continued to assault the windows with relentless persistence. Ethan had finally fallen asleep an hour earlier, exhausted by the emotional weight of a day spent dodging questions he could not answer and accusations he did not understand. Nathan stared at the phone for 3 rings before picking it up, expecting a wrong number, or perhaps Frank checking in to report on the latest developments in town. The voice on the other end was neither. The words came through clear and controlled, carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Mr. Mercer, this is Victoria Sterling. I need to meet you tonight. There's something in your file that I found, something important that changes everything I thought I knew about my company and my family." Nathan's hand tightened around the phone, his knuckles whitening in the dim light. "How did you get this number?" Victoria's response was matter-of-fact, unapologetic. "I have resources. That's not important right now. What's important is that I believe someone wanted you silent 6 years ago, and I believe that same someone may have tried to kill me 2 days ago. I'm already on my way to your location. I should be there in about 10 minutes. Nathan felt the familiar tension building in his shoulders, the defensive posture of a man who had learned through painful experience that involvement with powerful people led only to destruction. "I don't think that's a good idea. The press is watching this area. If you're seen coming here, it will only make things worse for both of us." Victoria's tone carried an edge of urgency that cut through his objections. "I know they're watching. I also know that whoever is behind this isn't going to stop with bad press coverage. I have documents that prove my uncle signed off on the defective systems that killed your wife. I have evidence that the same kind of tampering that destroyed your life may have been used to bring down my plane. If we don't act quickly, neither of us may get another chance." A thud from Ethan's room interrupted before Nathan could respond. The sound was wrong, too heavy for a book falling, too sharp for a child simply shifting in his sleep. Nathan dropped the phone and moved toward the hallway, his heart already racing with a fear that bypassed rational thought entirely. Ethan was sitting upright in his bed, clutching his chest with both hands, his face pale and drenched in sweat that glistened in the faint light from the hallway. His mouth hung open and struggling to drag air into lungs that seemed to have forgotten how to function. Each breath was shallow, thin, desperate, the terrible sound of airways closing against their owner's will. Nathan grabbed the inhaler from the bedside table, the emergency medication that had saved his son's life 3 times before during attacks that came without warning in the night. He shook it, pressed it to Ethan's lips, and squeezed. Nothing happened. No hiss of medication, no relief flooding into struggling lungs. The canister was empty. Panic seized Nathan's throat as he tore open the bathroom cabinet where he kept the backup inhaler, the one he checked every month to ensure it was full and ready for exactly this kind of emergency. The shelf where it should have been sitting was bare. The medication was gone. A cold realization crept through Nathan's terror. He had checked that cabinet 3 days ago. The backup inhaler had been there full and ready. Someone had been in his home. Someone had taken it. Ethan's gasping grew more desperate, his lips beginning to take on the bluish tint that signaled oxygen deprivation reaching dangerous levels. His small fingers clutched at the bed sheets, then at Nathan's arm, seeking reassurance that his father could not provide. The boy's eyes were wide with terror, the primal fear of suffocation overwhelming every other thought. Nathan scooped his son into his arms and ran for the front door, his mind racing through options that all seemed impossibly far away. The nearest hospital was 40 minutes by car, on roads that became treacherous in heavy rain. An ambulance would take even longer to reach them, assuming cell service held long enough to complete the call. Every second that passed was a second closer to the point of no return. He burst through the front door and into the rain, ready to sprint for his truck, when headlights flooded the yard in a harsh white glare. A black sedan skidded to a stop at the edge of the porch, sending gravel spraying across the wet ground. Victoria Sterling emerged from the driver's side before the engine had fully stopped, her eyes taking in the scene with the quick assessment of someone accustomed to crisis management. Her words cut through the rain and Nathan's panic with surgical precision. "Get in, now, I know a faster route to the hospital." Nathan had no time to question how she had arrived at the exact moment of catastrophe, no space in his terror-filled mind to wonder at the coincidence. He dove into the backseat, cradling Ethan against his chest, feeling his son's heart racing like a trapped bird beneath ribs that seemed far too fragile to contain such desperate energy. Victoria was back behind the wheel before he had fully closed the door, and the car tore down the dirt road with an acceleration that pressed Nathan back into the leather seats. The drive that usually took 40 minutes, Victoria crushed into 25. She drove with the focused intensity of a race car driver, taking corners at speeds that should have sent them spinning off the mountain roads, somehow maintaining control through sheer force of will. The windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the deluge visibility, reduced to a few meters of rain-blurred darkness, punctuated by the harsh glare of headlights. Nathan held Ethan close, his words cracking with desperation as he whispered encouragement that felt hollow against the reality of his son's deteriorating condition. "Stay with me, Ethan. Stay with me. We're almost there. Just keep breathing. one breath at a time. You can do this. Ethan's responses grew weaker as the minutes passed, his struggles less pronounced, his grip on Nathan's shirt loosening in a way that sent ice through his father's veins. The bluish tint around his lips deepened. His eyes began to lose focus, drifting toward a place Nathan could not follow. The emergency room doors burst open as Victoria brought the car to a screaming halt at the entrance. Nurses rushed out with a gurney, responding to the frantic honking that had announced their arrival. Nathan laid Ethan on the wheeled bed, his hands trembling so violently that he could barely release his grip on his son's small body. A doctor in green scrubs took over, immediately barking orders that Nathan heard only as distant sounds while he watched his entire world being wheeled away through swinging doors. Nathan collapsed into a plastic chair in the hallway outside the treatment room, his body finally releasing the tension that had kept him functional during the crisis. He buried his face in his hands, breath coming in ragged gasps that bordered on sobs. The fluorescent lights above hummed with indifferent constancy, illuminating a corridor that smelled of antiseptic and fear. Victoria stood a few steps away, her coat soaked with rain, her hair plastered against her cheeks. She did not speak, did not offer platitudes or false comfort. She simply stood there, a presence that acknowledged the gravity of the moment without trying to minimize it. An hour passed in silence, broken only by the occasional sound of footsteps and the distant beeping of medical equipment. Finally, a doctor emerged through the swinging doors, his expression carrying the exhausted relief of someone who had just won a battle against death. Dr. Michael Chen, according to the name badge on his white coat, was a man in his 50s with steady hands and kind eyes that had clearly seen too much suffering to be fazed by any single case. His words came out measured, professional, designed to convey information without unnecessary alarm. He's stable, we got him on a nebulizer in time and his oxygen levels are coming back up. We'll keep him overnight for observation, but he's going to make a full recovery. You got him here just in time. Another few minutes and we might be having a very different conversation. Nathan exhaled a sound that fell somewhere between a laugh and a sob relief, flooding through him with such force that it left him momentarily dizzy. He stood on unsteady legs and moved toward the treatment room, needing to see his son, needing to confirm with his own eyes that Ethan was truly safe. The boy lay on his side in the hospital bed, eyes half closed beneath the soft haze of an oxygen mask. Monitors beeped steadily, tracking vital signs that had returned to acceptable ranges. Color was returning to his cheeks, replacing the terrifying pallor that had made him look like a ghost only an hour before. Nathan sat beside the bed, taking his son's small hand in his own, feeling the warmth that confirmed life, continuing where it had nearly ended. Tears slipped down his face, unchecked relief and residual terror, mixing into an emotional storm that he made no effort to control. Ethan's words came out as barely more than a whisper filtered through the oxygen mask and the exhaustion of his ordeal. Dad, the pretty lady, is she an angel? Nathan managed a wet laugh, wiping his eyes with his free hand. Maybe, son, maybe she is. Victoria appeared in the doorway, hesitant to intrude on the intimate moment, but drawn forward by something she could not name. Nathan looked up at her, his eyes red and wet, filled with a gratitude that went beyond words. His tone shook as he spoke. Thank you. If it weren't for you, I would have lost him. I would have lost everything. Victoria stepped into the room, her words softer than Nathan had heard them before. You don't have to face this alone, not anymore. The words hung in the air between them, carrying weight that extended far beyond their literal meaning. Two strangers brought together by catastrophe, connected by losses, they were only beginning to understand, standing at the threshold of a choice that would change both their lives. Nathan reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small USB drive, black and unremarkable, the kind of object that could hold either nothing of importance or secrets that could topple empires. He held it out toward Victoria, his hands steady despite the emotional turbulence still coursing through him. His explanation came out low, almost confessional. Everything I saved, the warnings, the emails, the test data, the evidence, everything from 6 years ago, I kept copies despite the confidentiality agreement because I knew someday the truth would need to come out. I just never thought I would be the one to release it. Victoria stared at the USB, her fingers slowly closing around the cold metal. Why are you giving this to me? Nathan's answer was simple, direct. Because you're the only one who can do anything about it. I'm a disgraced engineer living in the mountains bound by legal agreements that would bankrupt me if I spoke publicly. You're the CEO of Sterling Aerospace. You have the platform, the resources, the credibility. If the truth is going to come out, it has to come from you. Victoria inhaled deeply, feeling the weight of responsibility settling onto her shoulders like a physical burden. The USB in her hand was not just data storage. It was a weapon, a key, a confession, and an accusation, all compressed into a few grams of plastic and silicon. She met Nathan's eyes with a resolve that surprised even herself. Then I will, I promise. But as she tightened her grip on the USB, another thought slid into her mind, cold as the night wind that had followed them through the hospital doors. The timing of Ethan's attack, the empty inhaler that should have been full, the missing backup medication. Too many coincidences stacking on top of each other, forming a pattern that pointed towards something far more sinister than bad luck. Victoria looked at Nathan, the man who had once again found himself at the edge of losing everything he loved. A chilling thought rose up from somewhere deep in her gut. Was someone trying to hurt him? Was someone trying to silence him? And were they starting by targeting the thing he loved most? She asked the question that had been forming in her mind. Nathan, the backup inhaler. You said it was missing. When did you last check it? Nathan's brow furrowed as he processed her question through the fog of exhaustion and relief. 3 days ago, I check it every month, but I happened to look 3 days ago when I was cleaning in the bathroom cabinet. It was there, full. Victoria felt a chill run down her spine. And your cabin, do you lock it when you leave? Nathan shook his head slowly, realization dawning in his eyes. No, nobody does out here. There's never been a reason to. Victoria pulled out her phone and began typing rapidly. I'm going to have someone check the security footage from the gas station near your property. It's the only camera for miles. If someone drove to your cabin in the last 3 days, they would have had to pass it. The implications of what she was suggesting hung heavy in the air between them. Someone had entered Nathan's home. Someone had deliberately removed his son's emergency medication. Someone had tried to create exactly the kind of crisis that would distract Nathan, consume him with grief, perhaps even destroy him entirely. If that was true, then whoever did this was still out there, and they were certainly nowhere near finished. In a mansion perched on a hill overlooking San Francisco Bay, Marcus Sterling sat in his private study, illuminated only by the dancing flames of a marble fireplace. The room was decorated in the style of old money leather-bound books lining the walls, antique furniture polished to a mirror-shine paintings that cost more than most people earned in a decade. He held a crystal tumbler of single malt whiskey, swirling the amber liquid slowly as he watched the fire consume a log with patient inevitability. His phone rang with a tone reserved for calls that required immediate attention. He answered without looking at the screen, already knowing who would be on the other end. The voice that came through was flat, emotionless, the professional detachment of someone paid to deliver information without editorial commentary. Sir, Ms. Sterling just left the hospital. She was with the Mercer man for several hours. The boy had a medical emergency, appears to be asthma-related. Marcus set down his whiskey, his eyes narrowing with an interest that would have chilled anyone who witnessed it. Medical emergency. How unfortunate. Did our intervention achieve its intended effect? A pause on the other end, barely perceptible. The boy survived. They reached the hospital in time. Ms. Sterling provided transportation. Marcus stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights that sparkled below like fallen stars. His reflection in the glass showed a face that might have been handsome once, but had hardened over decades into something closer to carved stone. When he spoke again, his tone carried no emotion whatsoever, not anger, not disappointment, not even frustration. His words came out as cold calculations. Survived. That's unfortunate. The objective was to create a distraction, something to keep Mercer occupied with personal concerns while we addressed the larger problem. A grieving father would have been too consumed by loss to pursue matters that don't concern him. The voice on the phone maintained its professional neutrality. Should I arrange another intervention? Marcus considered the question for a long moment, weighing options with the same detachment he would apply to a business decision involving quarterly projections and market analysis. Finally, he shook his head, though the gesture was invisible to his caller. His instructions were precise, methodical no. Another incident so soon would raise suspicions. We need to be more subtle, focus on Victoria instead. I want to know everything she's doing, everyone she's meeting, every file she's accessing. If she has something that could damage the company, I need to know what it is and where she's keeping it before she has a chance to use it." The call ended without farewell. Marcus returned to his chair, picked up his whiskey, and resumed his contemplation of the fire. He had built this company from the shadow of his brother's modest engineering firm into an aerospace giant that moved markets and influenced governments. He had made decisions that others lacked the courage to make, accepted consequences that others refused to acknowledge, done what was necessary when necessity demanded it. The death of Sarah Mercer had been regrettable but unavoidable. The defect in the hydraulic system would have been discovered eventually, and a recall would have cost billions, enough to potentially bankrupt the company during a period of aggressive expansion. The risk calculation had been simple: a small probability of failure multiplied by a limited number of potential casualties versus the certain destruction of everything he had worked to build. Mathematics favored proceeding with production, and mathematics did not lie. Nathan Mercer had been a nuisance, a moralistic engineer who did not understand that business operated by different rules than the academic laboratories where theories were tested without consequences. His warnings had been noted, evaluated, and dismissed because the analysis showed that the potential benefits of moving forward outweighed the potential costs. That Sarah Mercer had been among those costs was tragic, but tragedy was simply another variable to be managed through legal agreements and financial settlements. Now Victoria was digging into matters that should have remained buried, stirring up ghosts that Marcus had spent considerable resources putting to rest. His niece had always been idealistic, a trait she inherited from her father, Marcus's brother, who had founded Sterling Aerospace with dreams of advancing human flight rather than maximizing shareholder value. That idealism had been useful when it came to public relations and company culture, but it became dangerous when it led to investigations that threatened the foundations upon which the company's success was built. Marcus would handle Victoria as he had handled every other obstacle in his path, with patience, precision, and an absolute willingness to do whatever was necessary to protect what he had created. Family loyalty had its limits, and those limits ended where the survival of his legacy began. 3 days passed before Victoria felt prepared to take the next step. She spent those days in careful preparation, reviewing the files Nathan had given her, consulting with lawyers whose discretion could be trusted, and making arrangements that would protect the evidence, even if something happened to her personally. The paranoia that had seemed excessive on the night of her near-fatal car ride had solidified into justified caution as she realized the full scope of what she was confronting. The security footage from the gas station had confirmed her worst suspicions. A black SUV with tinted windows had passed the camera heading toward Nathan's property 2 nights before Ethan's attack, then returned 3 hours later heading back toward the main highway. The license plate was registered to a shell company that, after several layers of corporate obfuscation, traced back to a security firm that had done contract work for Sterling Aerospace for over a decade. Someone had been sent to Nathan's cabin. Someone had deliberately removed the medication that could save his son's life. And that someone was connected to her own company, to her own family, to the uncle who had warned her not to dig through old files. The meeting took place in a small, unmarked conference room inside a law office on the edge of downtown San Francisco. Victoria had chosen the location specifically because it had no connection to Sterling Aerospace, no history of representing any parties involved in the matter at hand, no reason for anyone watching her movements to suspect its significance. Victoria sat at one end of a long table. Nathan sat at the other, having driven down from the mountains after arranging for Frank Patterson to watch Ethan during his absence. Between them, Dr. Rebecca Walsh, an independent forensic engineer with 3 decades of experience in aviation safety, connected the USB to her laptop with the careful movements of someone who understood that the data she was about to review might be explosive in more than a metaphorical sense. The ceiling projector hummed to life, and the screen on the wall began displaying the files that Nathan had preserved for 6 years. Emails with subject lines marked urgent in blazing red. Scanned pages of handwritten notes showing calculations that predicted exactly the kind of failure that had occurred. Technical schematics covered in red ink annotations pointing out stress points and material weaknesses. Photographs of cracked metal components taken during inspections that should have triggered immediate recalls. Test data showing failure rates that exceeded acceptable parameters by margins that made Rebecca Walsh's face grow increasingly grim as she reviewed each document. She opened one email, reading aloud in a voice tight with barely controlled outrage. Hydraulic control system exhibits catastrophic failure potential under continuous load. Recommend immediate grounding of all units pending redesign. Sign, Nathan Mercer, Senior Engineer. She clicked to the next document, a response sent 3 days later. Concern noted, continue production. Another file opened, this one, a technical memorandum from the chief engineer to the executive board. Minor technical issue flagged by junior engineer. Recall costs estimated at $2.3 billion. Recommend internal review rather than public action. Rebecca leaned back in her chair, her expression a mixture of professional assessment and personal disgust. Her words came out measured, each one carrying the weight of expertise earned through decades of analyzing exactly these kinds of failures. This is undeniable, incriminating evidence. The person who approved these systems knew they were unstable, knew human lives were at risk, and chose to proceed anyway to avoid financial consequences. Victoria's tone dropped to something barely above a whisper. Who signed off on it? Rebecca opened the scanned approval form that had authorized continued production despite the documented risks. At the bottom of the page, in blue ink that had somehow retained its color through years of storage, was a signature that Victoria had seen thousands of times on birthday cards and Christmas gifts in company documents that crossed her desk for executive review. Marcus Sterling. The room fell into silence, the kind of silence that follows revelations too large to be immediately processed. Nathan sat motionless, his face unreadable, as though every emotion had been locked behind a door that he had learned to keep firmly closed. Victoria stared at the screen, her hand resting on the table with fingers rigid as though bracing against a physical blow. Rebecca spoke again, her words carrying the clinical detachment of an expert witness who had testified in cases like this before. He approved continued production to avoid a recall. A recall would have cost the company billions, damaged its reputation, possibly triggered investigations into other products. So he buried the reports, silenced the engineer who raised concerns, and gambled that the defect would never manifest in a way that could be traced back to company negligence. She turned to Nathan, acknowledging his presence in the room with a respect that seemed at odds with the way he had been treated by the company he once served. He blamed the pilot when the explosion happened, and when that explanation proved insufficient to prevent questions, he made sure the man who had warned them would never be able to warn anyone else. Nathan's response came out flat, drained of the anger that had once burned within him. They fired me the day after the explosion, threatened to ruin me if I ever spoke a word about what I knew, said I would never work in aerospace again, that they would ensure every company in the industry knew I was a troublemaker who made unfounded accusations against his employers. They made me sign an agreement that turned my silence into a legal obligation enforced by the threat of financial destruction. Victoria rose abruptly and walked to the window. Rain left long streaks across the cold glass, distorting the view of the city beyond into something abstract and uncertain. Her reflection stared back at her, a woman standing at a crossroads that would define the rest of her life. Her words carried the weight of calculation mixed with conscience. If I make this public, the company will collapse. Thousands of people will lose their jobs. My family's reputation will be destroyed forever. Everything my father built, everything I've worked to maintain, will be reduced to ash and legal proceedings. Nathan looked at her across the length of the conference table, his eyes meeting her reflected gaze in the window. And if you don't, more people will die. The same systems or systems like them are still in production. The same culture that buried my warnings is still making decisions about what risks are acceptable. Your plane went down because someone decided to solve a problem by eliminating the person asking questions. How long before they try again? How long before someone who doesn't survive a crash becomes another statistic in a report that gets filed away and forgotten? Victoria turned from the window, facing him directly. Two people connected by tragedy, standing on opposite sides of a choice that only one of them could make. Her decision came out quiet but absolute. Then I know what I have to do. Victoria then placed a folder on the table, her expression hardening. There's something else, something I discovered in the last 3 days that changes everything. She opened the folder and spread photographs across the table. Security camera footage showing a black SUV, license plate records. corporate registration documents tracing ownership through shell companies back to Sterling Aerospace. Her words were measured, each one landing like a hammer blow. Someone entered Nathan's cabin 2 nights before Ethan's asthma attack. Someone removed his backup inhaler, the medication that could have saved his son's life. The vehicle that made that trip can be traced back to a security firm that has worked for Sterling Aerospace for over a decade. Nathan's face went pale as the implications sank in. His hands gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned white. Victoria continued, her gaze fixed on the documents before her. My uncle didn't just cover up defective systems 6 years ago. He didn't just silence the engineer who tried to warn people. When that engineer resurfaced by saving my life, Marcus tried to eliminate the threat again. And this time he was willing to hurt a child to do it. Rebecca Walsh looked between them, her professional composure finally cracking. You have evidence of attempted harm to a minor. Victoria nodded grimly. I have enough to add attempted endangerment charges to the corporate negligence case. Marcus Sterling didn't just make a business decision that cost lives. He actively tried to hurt a 9-year-old boy to protect his secrets. Nathan's words came out strangled, barely audible. He tried to kill my son, to keep me quiet. Victoria met his eyes, and in that moment, whatever hesitation she had felt about exposing her family disappeared completely. He tried, he failed, and now he's going to answer for it. The days that followed were a blur of activity concealed beneath a surface of apparent normalcy. Victoria returned to Sterling Aerospace each morning, attended meetings, signed documents, smiled at colleagues who had no idea that she was systematically building a case that would bring down everything they had worked to create. She lunched with Marcus twice during that period, maintaining the fiction of family harmony while studying his expressions for signs that he suspected what she was doing. At night in the secure apartment she had rented under an assumed name, Victoria worked with a growing team of allies to prepare for the confrontation that was coming. Dr. Rebecca Walsh compiled a comprehensive technical report that would withstand scrutiny from the FAA, the NTSB, and any court in the country. Lawyers drafted statements and anticipated counterattacks. Former employees who had been silenced like Nathan were contacted. Their stories documented their willingness to testify, secured through promises of legal protection. Marcus was not idle during this period. Victoria noticed the surveillance almost immediately, the unfamiliar faces that appeared too frequently in her vicinity, the sense of being watched that prickled at the back of her neck during moments that should have been private. Her phone began exhibiting strange behavior, battery draining faster than usual, occasional clicks on the line during calls. Her office computer showed signs of access during hours when she was demonstrably elsewhere. She countered these intrusions with measures of her own, using encrypted communications, meeting informants in locations that could not be anticipated, maintaining multiple copies of critical evidence in secure facilities that Marcus could not reach. It was a shadow war fought without acknowledgement on either side, each opponent maneuvering for position while maintaining the pretense that nothing unusual was occurring. 1 week after the meeting with Dr. Walsh, Marcus appeared in the Victoria's office without warning. He closed the door behind him and sat in the chair across from her desk, his posture radiating the confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. His opening words carried the weight of his chess master, making an opening gambit. You're playing a dangerous game, Victoria, one that I don't think you fully understand. Victoria kept her expression neutral, her words carrying a calm she did not feel. I'm not sure what you're referring to, Uncle Marcus. His laugh was short, humorless, the sound of a predator amused by prey that did not yet realize it was trapped. Don't insult my intelligence. I know you've been accessing archived personnel files. I know you've been meeting with lawyers who have no connection to our corporate legal team. I know you've been in contact with former employees who were terminated under circumstances that required confidentiality agreements. The only question is what you intend to do with whatever you think you found. Victoria stood circling her desk to stand closer to him, refusing to be intimidated by his position or his reputation. What I found is evidence that you approved systems you knew were defective. Evidence that people died because you chose profit over safety. Evidence that you've been covering up corporate negligence for years while presenting yourself as a pillar of industry leadership. Marcus rose to meet her, the distance between them shrinking to something that felt almost threatening. Evidence collected through unauthorized access to confidential company records. Evidence that violates the terms of settlements reached with full legal representation. Evidence that could be characterized as corporate espionage if it fell into the hands of prosecutors looking to make a name for themselves. Victoria did not back down. Evidence that proves you killed people, Marcus, not with your own hands, but with decisions you made in boardrooms, while real human beings trusted that the planes they were boarding had been built by people who cared whether they lived or died. She paused, then added words that made Marcus's expression flicker for the first time. And evidence that you sent someone to Nathan Mercer's cabin 3 days ago? Evidence that you had his son's medication removed. Evidence that you tried to kill a 9-year-old boy to keep his father silent. Marcus's composure cracked just for a moment, just enough for Victoria to see the calculation happening behind his eyes. He had not expected her to know about that. He had not expected her to have proof. His tone dropped to something cold, threatening. You have no idea what it takes to run a company like this. The decisions that have to be made, the trade-offs that can't be avoided, the realities of competing in an industry where weakness means extinction. Your father understood that even if he pretended otherwise in public. Everything I've done to protect what he built. Victoria's response came out quiet but unyielding. My father would never have signed off on systems he knew could kill people. He would never have tried to murder a child. That's the difference between what he built and what you've turned it into. Marcus stepped closer, his face inches from hers, his words a whisper that carried more menace than any shout. If you pursue this, I will destroy you. Not just professionally, not just financially, but completely. I will ensure that every aspiration you've ever had turns to dust in your hands. I will take everything you care about and reduce it to nothing. That is not a threat, Victoria. It is a promise. Victoria met his gaze without flinching, something hardening in her chest that felt like either courage or desperation. I survived a plane crash that you probably arranged. I watched a man I'd never met risk his life to save me. A man whose wife died because of decisions you made. I've seen what happens to people who try to do the right thing in this company, and I've decided I would rather be destroyed, standing for something, than preserved standing for nothing. Marcus stared at her for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes that might have been respect or might have been recalculation. Then he stepped back, adjusted his suit jacket, and walked toward the door. His parting words floated back over his shoulder. You're more like your father than I thought. He also believed that principles mattered more than survival. Look where that got him. Then he was gone, leaving Victoria alone in her office with the weight of what was coming pressing down on her shoulders. The confrontation she had been preparing for was no longer theoretical. The battle lines had been drawn and there would be no retreat for either side. The night before the board meeting that would change everything, Victoria drove to Nathan's cabin. She arrived as the sun was setting, painting the lake in shades of gold and amber that seemed too beautiful for the gravity of the moment. No convoy of black cars accompanied her, no assistance with tablets and folders. Just a woman in jeans and a sweater, carrying a bag of groceries and the burden of a decision that would affect thousands of lives. Nathan was waiting on the porch when she arrived, having seen her headlights approaching through the trees. Ethan stood beside him, fully recovered from his ordeal, bouncing with the energy of a child who had been promised a visitor. The boy ran toward her car before she had even fully stopped. You came back. Victoria crouched down to meet his eyes, smiling in a way that felt genuine despite everything. I promised I would, didn't I? Nathan approached more slowly, his expression mixing surprise with something that might have been hope. I didn't think you would actually come. Victoria straightened, meeting his gaze directly. I'm not here as a CEO tonight. I'm here as someone who owes you more than I can ever repay. I brought dinner, if that's all right. The meal unfolded in the small, warm kitchen with an ease that surprised all of them. Pasta with marinara sauce, garlic bread, a large bowl of salad that Ethan approached with the suspicion common to 90-year-olds confronted with vegetables. The boy talked excitedly about his model airplanes, demonstrating wing configurations and explaining thrust-to-weight ratios with a sophistication that revealed how much he had absorbed from his father's technical background. Victoria listened with genuine interest, asking questions that showed she understood more about aerospace engineering than her business-focused role might suggest. After Ethan had been tucked into bed, Nathan and Victoria sat on the porch, each holding a cup of coffee that steamed in the cool mountain air. The sky had filled with stars, more stars than Victoria had ever seen in her life, spent in cities where light pollution obscured the universe. The silence between them was comfortable, two people who had said enough hard things to appreciate the value of moments without words. Nathan spoke first, his words carrying the weariness of a man who had carried heavy burdens alone for too long. I lost faith in people a long time ago. After Sarah died, after they fired me and threatened me into silence, I believed that doing the right thing only gets you crushed, that the world rewards those who play by its rules and destroys those who try to change them. Victoria turned toward him, her expression open in a way that corporate masks never allowed. And now Nathan's answer came slowly, each word considered before it was spoken. Now I think maybe it still matters. Because of what you're doing, you're risking everything, your career, your reputation, your family relationships, not because you have to, but because you believe it's right. Not many people would make that choice. Most would find reasons to look away, to convince themselves that the problems are too big or too complicated or someone else's responsibility. Victoria shook her head, gently deflecting the praise with characteristic modesty. I'm only doing what you did first. If anyone deserves the word brave, it's you. I'm just finally listening to what you tried to tell us 6 years ago. She paused, her gaze drifting toward the darkness beyond the porch. I can't stop thinking about Sarah, a woman I never met whose death I share responsibility for even though I didn't know about it until days ago. I can't undo what happened. I can't bring her back or give Ethan the mother he deserved to have, but I can make sure it never happens again, to anyone ever. That's the only amends available to me, and I intend to make it. Nathan's words softened with an emotion he had not allowed himself to feel in years. You already have. Whatever happens tomorrow, whatever the consequences turn out to be, you've already done more than anyone else was willing to do. That matters. It matters more than you know. Victoria stood to leave, pausing at the edge of the porch to look back at him. The moonlight caught her features, revealing a vulnerability she rarely showed to anyone. Her words came out quiet, almost hesitant. There's a position available, head of safety and compliance. Not glamorous, but critical. And I don't think anyone is more qualified than you. Nathan stiffened, the old defensive instincts rising. I'm not sure I'm ready to step back into that world. Victoria nodded, accepting his hesitation without pressing. You don't have to decide tonight. Just think about it. The company is going to need people who aren't afraid of the truth, who have already proven they'll fight for what's right, even when it costs them everything. That's you, Nathan. That's who you've always been, even when the world punished you for it. She descended the porch steps and walked toward her car. Nathan watched her go, feeling something shift inside him that he had thought was permanently frozen. Hope, perhaps, or something close to it. Victoria paused with her hand on the car door, turning back for one final exchange. You pulled me out of the lake. Tomorrow I'm going to pull both of us out of the darkness. Then she was gone, taillights disappearing into the mountain night, leaving Nathan alone with the stars and a future that suddenly seemed less certain, but somehow more possible than it had in years. The emergency board meeting convened at 8 o'clock on a Thursday morning that dawned gray and heavy with the threat of rain. Victoria arrived at the Sterling Aerospace headquarters 40 minutes early, walking through corridors she had traveled thousands of times before, but that now felt foreign, hostile, as though the building itself sensed that she had come to tear down everything it represented. Security guards nodded at her with their usual deference, unaware that the woman they were greeting carried documents in her slim leather briefcase that would destroy careers and rewrite the company's history before the day was done. The 40th floor conference room was already filling when Victoria entered. Executive officers in tailored suits occupied their assigned seats around the gleaming long table, tablets glowing with agenda items and financial projections, ceramic cups steaming with coffee that cost more per pound than some families spent on groceries in a week. Lawyers lined the walls like soldiers awaiting orders. Leather folders clutched to their chests, faces carefully neutral in the way that legal professionals learn to maintain regardless of the chaos unfolding around them. Marcus Sterling sat at the head of the table, positioned in front of floor-to-ceiling windows that framed him against the San Francisco skyline like a portrait of corporate power. His silver hair was immaculately styled, his navy suit pressed to perfection, his expression carrying the composed confidence of a man who believed himself master of every situation he encountered. Sunlight streamed through the glass behind him, casting a cold sheen across his shoulders that made him appear almost luminous, almost untouchable. Victoria entered last carrying her slim briefcase and a tablet that contained everything she needed to bring his world crashing down. She did not take a seat. Instead, she walked directly to the front of the room, her heels clicking against the marble floor with a rhythm that drew every eye in her direction. Marcus smiled, the expression warm and welcoming and entirely false. Victoria, good, let's keep this brief. We need to address the media response to the crash investigation and shape our messaging before the next news cycle. Public perception is everything in situations like this. Victoria's response came out measured, controlled. I agree, public perception is everything. She stepped to the presentation screen, mounted on the wall, connected her tablet, and watched as the display flickered to life. The first image that appeared was an email, its date stamp showing 6 years and 4 months earlier, its subject line blazing in red letters that seemed to pulse with accusation. Hydraulic failure risk. Immediate action required. The sender's name was clearly visible at the bottom, Nathan Mercer. The room seemed to vibrate with sudden tension. Whispers slashed through the air like knives cutting silk. Board members exchanged glances that ranged from confusion to dawning horror. Marcus's smile faded, then vanished entirely. Victoria clicked to the next slide without commentary. A photograph appeared showing a hydraulic component split wide open, its internal structure revealing fractures that spread through the metal like disease through healthy tissue. Another click brought up a second email, this one sent from Marcus's own account. Bury this. We're not recalling 50 aircraft over a minor flaw. Production continues as scheduled. She left the words exactly as they were, making no attempt to soften or interpret them. The evidence spoke for itself with a clarity that required no embellishment. A board member shot to his feet, his face draining of color as the implications registered. If these documents are authentic, they represent a fundamental breach of our safety protocols and our legal obligations. Victoria's voice remained steady, almost clinical. They are entirely authentic. I have verified their provenance through independent forensic analysis, and I have additional documentation that traces the chain of custody from the original files to the copies you are seeing today. She clicked again. A scanned approval form appeared on the screen, the kind of bureaucratic document that normally attracted no attention, but that now seemed to glow with malevolent significance. At the bottom of the page, in blue ink that had somehow retained its color through years of storage, was Marcus Sterling's distinctive signature, authorizing continued production despite documented safety concerns. The Nevada test flight incident report followed. One civilian fatality listed in cold bureaucratic language, Sarah Mercer, wife of the engineer who had tried to prevent ethically the tragedy that killed her. Another board member rose, his face stark white against the dark fabric of his suit. He closed his folder without a word, gathered his belongings, and walked out of the room. A second followed within moments, then a third. The exodus continued until less than half the seats around the table remained occupied, the empty chairs standing as silent testimony to the magnitude of what had been revealed. Victoria clicked to the next slide and the room fell completely silent. Security camera footage appeared on the screen. A black SUV with tinted windows captured at a gas station timestamp, showing a date 3 days before Ethan Mercer's asthma attack. License plate records followed. Corporate registration documents tracing ownership through shell companies. A web of connections leading unmistakably back to Sterling Aerospace. Victoria's words cut through the silence like a blade. This vehicle was photographed traveling toward Nathan Mercer's property 2 nights before his 9-year-old son nearly died from an asthma attack. The same night, someone entered Mr. Mercer's cabin and removed his son's backup inhaler, the medication that could have saved the child's life. She clicked again. A medical report appeared documenting Ethan's emergency room admission and the narrow margin by which he had survived. Victoria's tone remained steady, but her eyes burned with barely contained fury. My uncle didn't just cover up defective systems 6 years ago. He didn't just silence the engineer who tried to warn people. When that engineer resurfaced, by saving my life, Marcus Sterling ordered an attempt on the life of a 9-year-old boy. Attempted harm to a minor. Ethan Mercer, age 9. Marcus's face turned ashen for the first time. The room fell completely silent. Even the lawyers against the wall seemed frozen, their professional detachment finally cracking in the face of evidence that went far beyond corporate negligence. Victoria turned to face her uncle directly, her gaze unwavering, despite the rage emanating from the man who had been her mentor, her family, her trusted advisor for her entire adult life. No, Uncle Marcus, you destroyed it. The day you chose money over human lives. The day you decided that shareholder value mattered more than the safety of the people who trusted us to build aircraft they could fly without fear. And the day you decided a child's life was an acceptable price for your silence. She placed her briefcase on the table in front of him, the gesture carrying the finality of a judge delivering a verdict. I resign as CEO effective immediately. I've contacted the FAA and provided them with complete copies of all relevant documentation, including evidence of the attempted endangerment of Ethan Mercer. They will be launching a full investigation, and I expect you will be hearing from federal prosecutors within the week. Marcus slammed his hand against the table with a force that made the water glasses tremble and sent ripples across the surface of untouched coffee. His composure finally cracking under the weight of what was happening. What do you think you're doing? Victoria, are you trying to destroy this company? Everything your father spent his life building. Victoria's response came out soft, each word landing like a precisely aimed blow. I'm not trying to be a hero. I'm just choosing what's right. Something you forgot how to do a long time ago if you ever knew it at all. She turned and walked toward the door, leaving behind chaos that erupted the moment she crossed the threshold. Chairs scraped against marble. Voices rose in accusation and defense. Phones rang with urgent calls from lawyers and public relations specialists and journalists who had somehow already caught wind that something momentous was occurring. Victoria heard none of it. Her focus had narrowed to the corridor ahead, the elevator bank at its end, the world beyond this building where consequences would unfold according to their own inexorable logic. The plaza outside Sterling Aerospace headquarters had transformed into a battlefield of cameras and microphones by the time Victoria emerged through the glass doors. Reporters had gathered in dense clusters, their questions overlapping into a cacophony of demands for information, confirmation, denial, anything that could be packaged into headlines and breaking news alerts. Security personnel struggled to maintain order as Victoria descended the steps, their efforts hampered by the sheer number of media representatives who had materialized as if summoned by some invisible signal. A reporter lunged forward, microphone extended like a weapon. Ms. Sterling, is it true you're accusing your own uncle of corporate negligence and attempted harm to a child? Victoria paused on the third step from the bottom, turning to address the assembled press with a composure that belied the turmoil still churning beneath her professional exterior. I'm not accusing anyone. The evidence speaks for itself, and I have provided that evidence to the appropriate regulatory authorities. I will cooperate fully with all investigations related to safety at Sterling Aerospace, past and present. Beyond that, I have no further comment at this time. Another reporter pushed closer. What about Marcus Sterling? Do you believe he should be held personally responsible for deaths that may have resulted from company decisions? Victoria's answer came out carefully measured. That determination is for investigators and courts to make, not for me. My role was to ensure that the relevant information reached the people who have the authority and expertise to evaluate it properly. I have fulfilled that responsibility to the best of my ability. She descended the remaining steps and walked toward her waiting car, ignoring the shouted questions that followed her like hungry dogs pursuing prey. Inside the vehicle, her hands finally began to shake, the adrenaline that had sustained her through the confrontation giving way to exhaustion and uncertainty about what would come next. She had done what she believed was right, but rightness offered no guarantee of outcome, no protection against the retribution that Marcus would certainly attempt to deliver. At the cabin by the lake, Nathan sat on his porch with his laptop balanced on his knees, watching the news unfold through a screen that felt both impossibly distant and uncomfortably intimate. The headline crawling across the bottom of the page read, "CEO exposes family cover-up in deadly aircraft scandal. Attempted harm to child alleged." Beneath it, footage showed Victoria descending the steps of Sterling Aerospace, her face composed and resolute, surrounded by the chaos she had deliberately created. He closed the laptop and set it aside, turning his attention to the lake that stretched before him in the late morning light. The water lay still, reflecting the mountains and the sky with mirror-perfect clarity, as if the natural world had decided to offer a moment of peace, in contrast to the human drama unfolding elsewhere. Nathan breathed deeply, filling his lungs with mountain air, and felt something loosen in his chest that had been tight for 6 long years. The front door swung open behind him, and Ethan burst onto the porch, clutching the airplane model he had finally finished assembling after weeks of careful work. The boy's face glowed with pride and excitement, emotions uncomplicated by the adult concerns that had shadowed his father's existence for as long as he could remember. Ethan's words carried the pure enthusiasm of childhood. "Dad, I finished it. Look, I got the wings perfectly level this time, and the landing gear actually retracts like a real plane." Nathan lifted his son into his lap, examining the model with the serious attention it deserved. "It's perfect, Ethan. You did an amazing job." The boy looked up, his brown eyes searching his father's face with an intensity that seemed too old for his 9 years. "Dad, do you think I could be an engineer like you someday? Build real planes that really fly?" Nathan's throat tightened with emotions he had not allowed himself to feel in years. He thought of Sarah, thought of the future they had planned together, thought of everything that had been stolen and everything that remained. He thought of the years spent hiding from the world, convincing himself that safety lay in isolation, that the only way to protect what he loved was to withdraw from everything else. His answer came out rough with feeling he could no longer suppress. "You can be anything you want to be, son, and I'll be here every step of the way helping you reach whatever dreams you decide to chase." 2 days later, Victoria returned to the valley. No convoy of black cars announced her arrival. No assistants accompanied her with tablets and folders and the paraphernalia of corporate power. She drove a rental sedan, wore jeans and a casual sweater, and carried nothing but a bag of groceries in a manila envelope containing documents that would change Nathan's life if he chose to accept what they offered. Nathan was waiting outside when she arrived, having heard her car approaching through the trees. Ethan stood beside him, bouncing on his heels with barely contained excitement. The boy ran toward her. "You came back again?" Victoria crouched to meet his eyes, her smile genuine and warm. "I told you I would, and I brought more books about airplanes, plus something special for your dad." Nathan approached more slowly, his expression mixing surprise with something that might have been hope. "I saw the news. All of it. You actually did it. You brought down your own family to expose what they did." Victoria straightened, meeting his gaze directly. "I brought down the people who deserve to fall. My family name means nothing if it's built on lies and covered in blood. My father would have understood that even if Marcus never did." She handed him the manila envelope with a gesture that carried more weight than its physical contents could account for. "I have something for you. A job offer if you want it. Head of Safety and Compliance for what's left of Sterling Aerospace after the restructuring is complete. Full authority over safety decisions, reporting directly to the new board with contractual protections that prevent anyone from overriding your recommendations or retaliating against you for making them." Nathan opened the envelope, scanning the documents inside with eyes that had reviewed thousands of technical specifications and legal agreements throughout his career. The terms were exactly as Victoria had described: comprehensive protections wrapped around a position that would give him real power to prevent tragedies like the one that had destroyed his family. His words came out uncertain, touching wounds that had not fully healed. "I'm not good at politics. I don't know how to navigate boardrooms or manage executives who think safety is an obstacle to profit." Victoria's response carried conviction born from everything she had witnessed and done. "Good. I don't need a politician. I need an engineer who sees what others miss, who speaks truth even when it's uncomfortable, who cares more about doing the right thing than about protecting his own position." That's you, Nathan. That's who you've always been, even when the world punished you for it. Ethan tugged at his father's sleeve, his young face earnest with an understanding that seemed to exceed his years. "Dad, you should do it. You're good at fixing things that are broken. And maybe it's time we stopped hiding from everything." Nathan looked at his son, then at Victoria, then at the documents in his hands that represented everything he had lost and everything he might reclaim. The decision felt enormous, a threshold that once crossed could never be uncrossed. His acceptance came out quiet but firm. "All right, I'll do it." Victoria's smile carried relief and something deeper, a sense of partnership forged through shared trauma and mutual respect. "Then let's go change the world, or at least the small part of it we can reach." 1 year later, the inauguration of the Sterling Safety Foundation took place in a building that looked nothing like the towering headquarters that had once housed the company's executive offices. The new structure was modest, constructed from sustainable materials designed to let natural light flood every workspace rather than projecting corporate intimidation through sheer scale. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered views of the surrounding landscape rather than the urban sprawl that had framed Marcus Sterling's reign. The crowd that gathered for the ceremony included engineers who had been silenced, families who had lost loved ones to preventable accidents, whistleblowers who had sacrificed careers for principles, students who represented the next generation of aerospace professionals. Journalists attended as well, their cameras capturing a moment that none of them would have predicted a year earlier when the scandal first broke. Victoria stood at the podium, her appearance transformed from the corporate executive who had walked into that fateful board meeting 12 months ago. She wore her hair naturally dressed professionally, but without the armor of designer labels, projected an authority that came from conviction rather than position. Her opening words carried across the assembled crowd with quiet power. 1 year ago, I nearly lost my life in a plane crash that should never have happened. A crash caused not by mechanical failure or pilot error, but by decisions made in boardrooms by people who valued profit more than the lives of those who trusted them. She paused, letting the weight of the statement settle before continuing. But one man chose differently. 6 years before my plane went down, Nathan Mercer warned my company about a critical flaw in our hydraulic systems. He sent 7 separate warnings, each one more urgent than the last, each one documenting exactly the danger that would eventually claim his wife's life and nearly claim mine. And for his courage, for his integrity, for his absolute commitment to doing what was right, he was fired, silenced, and forced into exile. Victoria's gaze found Nathan in the front row, seated beside Ethan, who wore a pressed shirt and watched the proceedings with solemn attention. This foundation exists because of people like him, people who refuse to stay silent when they see wrong being done, people who believe that doing the right thing matters even when it costs them everything they have. People who understand that the measure of a company or a person or a society is not how it treats those who go along with comfortable lies, but how it treats those who insist on uncomfortable truths. The room rose in sustained applause, the sound echoing off walls that had been designed to honor rather than intimidate. Behind Victoria, screens displayed headlines that traced the story's arc from scandal to transformation. Marcus Sterling convicted on 12 counts of corporate negligence, additional charges for attempted endangerment of minor. Sterling Aerospace announces comprehensive safety reforms. Families of crash victims praise unprecedented corporate accountability. Frank Patterson took the stage next to 72-year-old Vietnam veteran, standing before the crowd with the same steady calm he had shown in jungles half a world away. His weathered hands gripped the podium as he addressed the assembled journalists and dignitaries. Frank's words carried the weight of a lifetime spent watching people reveal their true characters in moments of crisis. I knew Nathan Mercer for 6 years before any of this happened. He fixed my chainsaw, looked after his boy, and never asked for anything from anyone. When that plane went down into the lake, he didn't think twice. He just jumped in. That's not the action of a man with something to hide. That's the action of a man who does what's right because it's right, not because anyone is watching. He paused, his eyes finding Nathan in the crowd. I met his father once years ago. The old man told me something that stuck with me. He said you can build a house from rotten wood if you want to. It'll look fine for a while, might even hold up through a storm or two. But eventually the truth of what's inside will come out, and everything you built on that bad foundation will come crashing down. Frank's gaze swept across the audience, his tone hardening. Marcus Sterling built his empire on rotten wood. He thought he could bury the truth deep enough that no one would ever find it. But truth always surfaces. And when it does, it's people like Nathan Mercer who have to clean up the mess. People like him who have to rebuild on honest foundations. The reception following the ceremony stretched into late afternoon. Nathan found himself surrounded by people who wanted to shake his hand to thank him, to tell him that his example had given them courage to speak up about concerns they had previously kept silent. Former colleagues from Sterling Aerospace approached with apologies and admiration in equal measure. Young engineers asked questions about safety protocols and ethical obligations. Families who had lost loved ones to aerospace accidents expressed gratitude that someone was finally fighting on their behalf. By the time the crowd began to thin, Nathan felt exhausted in a way that was entirely different from the weariness he had carried through years of isolation. This was the fatigue of connection, of engagement, of being present in a world that he had tried to escape. It was uncomfortable and unfamiliar, but beneath the discomfort lay something that felt remarkably like hope. Victoria found him near the exit, 2 cups of coffee in her hands, overwhelming. Nathan accepted the coffee with a grateful nod. Different. I spent 6 years convincing myself that the world didn't want what I had to offer, that speaking truth only led to punishment. Today felt like evidence that maybe I was wrong about that. Victoria sipped her own coffee, her gaze thoughtful. You weren't wrong. The world does punish people who speak inconvenient truths. It punished you terribly. But that doesn't mean the truth stops mattering. It just means that people who tell it need support, protection, institutions that will stand behind them when the powerful try to push back. She gestured at the building around them, at the foundation that bore her family's name, but served a purpose her uncle would have despised. That's what we're building here. A structure that makes it harder to silence people like you, harder to bury warnings until they become disasters, harder to choose profit over lives without consequence. Nathan looked at her, seeing not the corporate executive who had arrived at his cabin a year ago, but the woman who had risked everything to do what was right. Your father would be proud of you. Victoria's smile carried sadness and acceptance in equal measure. I hope so. I spent years trying to honor his legacy by protecting the company he built. It took nearly dying to realize that his real legacy wasn't a corporation. It was the values he tried to instill, the belief that excellence and integrity could coexist, that success built on wrongdoing was no success at all. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, 2 people who had found their way through darkness to something that resembled light. Then Ethan appeared, tugging at Nathan's sleeve with familiar urgency. Dad, can we go to the lake now? You promised we could go fishing when the boring grown-up stuff was done. Nathan laughed, a sound surprising him with its naturalness. The boring grown-up stuff is done. Let's go home. The drive back to Lake Tahoe took 3 hours, the familiar mountain roads unfolding beneath tires that had traveled them countless times before. Ethan fell asleep in the back seat, exhausted by the excitement of the day, his airplane model clutched in his hands even in slumber. Nathan drove in contemplative silence, watching the landscape shift from urban density to suburban sprawl to the wild beauty of the Sierra Nevada. Victoria followed in her own car, having accepted Nathan's invitation to spend a few days at the cabin before returning to the endless work of rebuilding a company from the ashes of its former corruption. The convoy of 2 vehicles wound through pine forests and past crystal lakes, climbing toward the valley that had sheltered Nathan through his years of exile, and that now felt less like a hiding place and more like a home. They arrived as sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and amber and deep crimson colors that reflected off the lake's surface and transformed the ordinary landscape into something approaching the sublime. Nathan carried the sleeping Ethan inside and tucked him into bed, then returned to find Victoria standing at the water's edge, her shoes discarded on the dock, her bare feet dangling over water that had witnessed tragedy and redemption in equal measure. He sat beside her, the wood of the dock warm beneath them from a day of absorbed sunlight. This is where it started, where I pulled you out. Victoria nodded, her eyes fixed on the distant mountains, and where you pulled me out of the darkness I didn't even know I was living in. I thought I was successful, powerful, in control of my life. I didn't realize how much of what I believed was built on foundations I had never examined. Nathan picked up a flat stone and skipped it across the water, watching the ripples spread outward in widening circles. I spent 6 years here, telling myself I was protecting Ethan by keeping us isolated from the world. But I think I was really just protecting myself from the pain of engaging with it again. Hiding felt safer than risking more loss. Victoria turned to look at him, her expression carrying understanding born from her own journey through fear and doubt. And now, Nathan's answer came slowly, each word carrying weight he had earned through years of suffering and the beginnings of healing. Upton. Now I think hiding was just another form of losing. Sarah didn't die so that I could spend the rest of my life running away from everything that mattered to her. She believed in me, believed I could make a difference. Honoring her memory means trying to live up to that belief even when it's terrifying. Victoria reached out and placed her hand over his, a gesture of connection that spoke of partnership, Mutual respect, the bond forged between people who had seen each other at their worst and chosen to believe in each other anyway. Her words came out soft, almost reverent. Sometimes the most precious thing isn't being saved. It's being given the chance to save yourself by helping others. They sat together as darkness gathered around them, stars emerging one by one until the sky blazed with more light than the cities below could ever produce. The lake reflected the celestial display, creating the illusion of floating between two infinite expanses of glittering points. Somewhere in the cabin behind them, Ethan dreamed whatever dreams visited 9-year-old boys who had seen too much loss and were just beginning to believe that the world might contain more than pain. Nathan spoke into the darkness, his tone carrying conviction that had been hard-won through years of doubt. The truth always resurfaces, like that plane in the lake. It may sink for a while, it may seem lost forever, but eventually it comes back up. The question is whether anyone is willing to dive down and bring it to the surface, or whether we just let it rot in the depths where no one has to look at it. Victoria smiled, though he could barely see her face in the starlight. You dove. When everyone else would have looked away, you went into the water. That's who you are, Nathan. That's who you've always been. In his new office at Sterling Aerospace, Nathan sat at a desk that offered views of San Francisco Bay through windows that stretched from floor to ceiling. The space was modest by executive standards, deliberately so reflecting his belief that the work mattered more than the trappings of authority. Technical books lined the shelves, references he still consulted despite years away from active engineering. Photographs occupied prominent positions, Ethan holding his completed airplane model, grinning with gap-toothed pride. Sarah smiling in golden sunlight, captured forever in a moment of happiness that predated the tragedy that would claim her. On his desk lay an open folder containing a proposal for improved safety protocols, modifications to inspection procedures that would catch potential failures before they could become disasters. Small changes in the grand scheme of things, incremental improvements that would never make headlines or earn public recognition, but they would save lives, prevent tragedies, protect families from the kind of loss that had shattered his own. And this time no one ignored them, no one overrode him, no one silenced him anymore. His phone buzzed with a text message, the notification pulling his attention from the documents spread before him. The message was from Ethan, sent from the phone Nathan had finally agreed to let him have for emergencies. Dad, I got an A in science. My teacher says I have a gift for understanding how things work. She says I could be an engineer like you someday. Nathan smiled, typing his response. I'm so proud of you. I'll be home soon and we can celebrate. Love you, son. He set the phone aside and leaned back in his chair, looking out at the bay that sparkled in the afternoon light. Sailboats cut white wakes across the blue water. Planes descended toward the airport in the distance, each one carrying passengers who trusted that the aircraft they boarded had been built by people who cared whether they lived or died. 6 years ago, Nathan had believed his life was over. He had signed away his voice, buried. His expertise retreated into isolation that felt like death without the mercy of ending. He had been wrong about so many things, wrong about the futility of resistance, wrong about the impossibility of justice, wrong about his own capacity to find meaning in a world that had taken so much from him. The truth always mattered. Speaking it always cost something. But silence cost more. Extracted payment in different currency demanded sacrifices that accumulated over years until the debt became unpayable. He had paid his debts. He had spoken his truth. And somehow, against odds that had seemed insurmountable, the truth had prevailed. The lake shimmered under twilight as Nathan drove the final miles toward home, the familiar road unspooling beneath his tires like a ribbon leading back to everything that mattered. The cabin emerged from the pines as it always did, modest and welcoming smoke rising from the chimney where someone had already started a fire against the evening chill. Ethan burst from the front door before Nathan had fully stopped the truck, racing toward his father with the boundless energy that was one of childhood's greatest gifts. Nathan caught his son in an embrace that lifted the boy off his feet, spinning him around while laughter echoed off the surrounding mountains. This was what he had fought for, what he had nearly lost, what he had somehow managed to save through years of patience and pain and the unexpected grace of a woman who had crashed into his life and refused to leave. Victoria's car was parked beside the cabin, her visits having become regular occurrences over the past months. She emerged from the front door as Nathan set Ethan down 2 glasses of wine in her hands, the gesture of hospitality that had replaced the formal offerings of corporate compensation that had characterized their first meeting. The three of them sat on the dock as darkness gathered feet dangling over water that had witnessed their story from its violent beginning to whatever this moment represented. Not an ending, Nathan realized. Nothing ever truly ended. But perhaps a new beginning, a chapter that started from a place of strength rather than desperation. Ethan's voice broke the comfortable silence, carrying the innocent profundity that children sometimes achieved without trying. "Dad, I've been thinking about what I want to be when I grow up." Nathan turned to his son, giving the question the serious attention it deserved. "Oh, and what have you decided?" Ethan's response came out with certainty that belied his years. "I want to build things that help people. Like you do. Things that work the way they're supposed to so nobody gets hurt because someone didn't care enough to do it right." Nathan felt his throat tighten with emotion that no longer frightened him the way it once had. He pulled his son close, resting his chin on the boy's head, looking out at the lake that had taken so much and given back more than he had any right to expect. His words came out rough but true. "That's exactly what your mother would have wanted for you, and I can't think of anything that would make me prouder." Victoria raised her glass in a silent toast, her expression carrying the weight of everything they had survived and the hope of everything that lay ahead. The stars emerged overhead, the same stars that had witnessed Nathan's darkest moments, now bearing witness to something that felt remarkably like peace. The lake lay still beneath them, patient and eternal, holding its secrets in depths that human eyes could not penetrate. But the surface reflected the sky above, creating a bridge between earth and heaven that seemed for this one moment close enough to touch. Nathan Mercer had saved a life and found redemption for his own. Victoria Sterling had lost an empire but reclaimed her soul. And Ethan, who had lost his mother before he could remember her face, now had a future built on truth and protected by integrity. A world where those who speak up are not punished for their courage. Where doing the right thing matters even when it costs everything. Where sometimes, just sometimes, even heroes get the ending they deserve.